And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already tonight. And tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, Saturday night, it's a hot one out there. And
It's
of
a
course,
beautiful night.
we're
September
coming.
is the best
It
month there
is. There's no question, especially around here in lovely Harvard Square. But I guess we're coming off the real bizarro Stepford Biden Queensryche launch of the Fourth Reich from the other night. That was really something. It's one of the reasons we're doing the Eighth Sphere tonight. I got a little alarm bell in the middle of all that. And I'm not very superstitious when I do journalistic work, but I have had a feeling in putting together the material for this episode that it is particularly timely. So we're really going to enjoy that. Love seeing the ideas room out there. And tonight we're going to take your questions in the second half of the program. I'm going to do 2 hours tonight. First half, I'm going to present to you all of this Eighth Sphere information and some things we may want to take a deeper look at in relation to this and some of the messages that Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, left behind for us, and the crucial aspect regarding the 21st century in particular, and also the unanswered questions remaining about the Eighth Sphere and how it figures into all the things that we're seeing with the Psycho Great Reset and the Belial cult and the Ahriman push that we're right in the middle of. There's no question that the Stepford Biden speech from the other night was a piece of that, doing it on the anniversary of World War I, which is, of course, September 1st, 1939, where the Nazis broke
World War II.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things when we look at that World War II anniversary is that when the Nazis came in and broke the line there into Poland, they did it with a false flag. And what they did is they actually took some people who were Polish in a radio station right there on the border, and they took them and, they killed them, and then they dressed them up in Nazi clothes, and that's how they got their false flag excuse to go in. And the false flag aspect, I think, is rife with the speech that we saw again from Stepford Biden the other night. The imagery, unmistakable. The people who are propping him up, of course, he doesn't have a whole lot going on to even do this, but those who are propping him up wanted to put this message out to start this season and the anniversary of the World War on this. It's quite interesting, too, when we think about the presence of Marines. Now, this is not a typical speech. This is a presidential speech, and so you're not supposed to have those types of accoutrement when you're giving a political speech the way that he did, saying that half the country were dangerous. And, this is all part of the idea of launching emergency powers for control. And we're seeing a good deal of that here in Canada, Australia, which we've been revealing through the COG program. I expect that to go into overdrive, and I expect that the UFO file is going to be right up there with it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time before we launch into the anthroposophical Eighth Sphere research on that UFO file right up front, because a few things have come out and they're repositioning the op ever so slightly and doing it in a particularly diabolical way, considering the op that we just came out of course, the COVID op. And as I've pointed out many times, if you thought the COVID op was bad, just wait till you see the UFO op. In the middle of all that, we can get the richness of that UFO file story from all the people who are doing good research around it. And unfortunately, more and more people are getting drawn into that web of CIA UFO threat disclosure. And we've done a lot of reporting on that, but it's a fast changing situation. And I want to keep our eyes on the players because they move them around on the board this week. And more CIA people that they're putting out there who they're saying are contactees. Now we have number 3. Of course, the first one was Jim Semivan, lifelong CIA high directorate. Then the second was John Ramirez. He said, I was a contactee, and that's why I'm out here, but 25-year veteran of the CIA. And now we have Gary Nolan, who is positioning himself to take over for Lou Elizondo's stumbling op and all the trouble that Lou has gotten into having fights with the likes of the New York Post, the Black Vault, Dark Journalist, and the list goes on and on. Too much baggage there, Lou, and they're switching you out for sure, baby. Now, it's pretty interesting, though, the route that they're taking, because the new guy is pure CIA's, but he comes from the that aspect of the CIA that is focusing on immunology. And so we're going to find some interesting things about this supposed truth teller, including his big pumping up of Anthony Fauci. And so we're going to know where these people are coming from. Imagine that. We're going to be looking at the Fauci UFO op. How you feeling about that? We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the show. Miss Olivia is going to be taking those, putting those together for us. And before I jump in, Miss Olivia, to the CIA UFO threat, what do you got?
Charles Wagner says, let us examine the significance of what is about to take place on today's show. 7th day of the week, 9th month, and 3rd day at 9 p.m. or 21st hour. Subject, the incarnation of Ahriman. Absolutely esoteric.
Right. Well, it's pretty interesting. That's somebody who's really steeped in numerology, I can tell. But you're going to have fun with me tonight because I have tarot quotes. There's all sorts of wildness going on in this episode. It is not your normal episode. It's really a kind of a classic X, sort of overview on the 8th sphere. And you're going to find some very, very interesting, unusual pieces coming in here. Okay. Now, let's get to this monkey business, because they are switching some things around with the Pentagon side of all this. What I've been noticing is lots and lots of people involved in the UFO threat op are suddenly coming out of Stanford. They're suddenly coming out of Radiance Technology, but there seems to be this overlap of medical people. And I noticed this initially when all the people who were on the To the Stars Academy board were all medical people. I thought that's weird. And even Lou himself has some medical patents. What is that? Patenting a disease, like a tropical disease? Sounds like fun, right? So it's very interesting to me what's been coming out and how they've been positioning the new guy, especially since he has a big X affiliation, and that is something called Stanford X. And that is a bio research that's going on there. It's a special group over there at Stanford, of which Nolan is a part. So let's get into a few things that they've been up to here. Of course, UFOs pose national security threat, lawmakers warn, right? This is the big push around the threat thing, just to keep us all on the same page. Now, Nolan, it's interesting because the UFO field hasn't done any research on him, but critics of the UFO field do. And what happens is those people get to the real truth that a smart research community would do, except we're always being blocked because all the people who lead on the alternative side, unfortunately, are very steeped in the CIA UFO threat ops. So we have a lot of people who are kind of blocking this and not letting it out, how much of a CIA presence there is on this. However, the CIA presence on this is crucial because that tag team of the UFO threat with the CIA and Homeland Security is something that is just unavoidable. And they are raising the stakes on it on a regular basis, including attaching it to the National Defense Authorization Act. So we're getting really our hands in on this and really pointing it out and pointing it out loudly, even if we're a lonely outpost in relation to it. Nolan, as I said, Stanford BioX, okay? So you're looking at mRNA technology, the vaccine backbone, molecule immunology, the whole shebang. This is where this Stanford professor scientist, who's now leading the UFO threat operation instead of Lou Elizondo, this is where he's coming from. And the X-steganography is always involved when you get around these. Now, this guy's getting a free ride by the likes of Tucker Carlson and all the rest, just sitting there going off, oh, I was a contactee and now I'm a CIA agent, but I want to bring everyone to Jesus on the UFO file. It's not going to happen. And one of the key things to communicate as part of the research community is that we're hip to this, that we understand what's going on. We understand it's been played and it's been planned out for a long time. And they've used a lot of stooges in between. And one of the guys that they've been having trouble with is Elizondo. And the word is in the background that they're going to try to switch to this scientist guy who is up to his neck in all kinds of connections with Fauci and all the rest. Now, one of the interesting things that this BioX lab does is something called hybrids, nature nanotechnology, where they make nanotechnology flowers. And some of the kind of creepier projects that they have going on over there, I'm probably going to do a show just on that. But BioX, the researchers at Stanford University have for the first time sequenced the genome of an unborn baby using only a blood sample from the mother. The findings from the new approach, published July 4th in Nature, are related to research that was reported a month ago. That research used a technique previously developed at Stanford to sequence a fetal genome using a blood sample from the mother. So these guys are very deep on the DNA tracking aspect of this. And the fact that they have an interest in hybridization with nanotech, and now one of their main guys is really deep on this UFO threat operation, is not a good combination of factors. So there's no worry that we're going to have a lot of time to get into BioX. But it's one of those things I'm putting on the map tonight because it's directly connected with this guy who now they're rolling out the red carpet for, because he has to replace Lou because Lou screwed it up. So now we have this Gary P. Nolan, and here is his salute to Dr. Fauci on Twitter. And it says, "Thank you, Dr. Fauci, for your tremendously positive contributions to immunology and virology." And there's a nice big picture there of Fauci. So this person who's supposedly now looking for UFO transformation, and that government better give it to us. Oh, wait, you work for the government. Oh, you work for the CIA, which is the most secretive level of the government. Yeah, I guess that government better give us some disclosure. But this whole, I'm tight with the Fauci crowd is particularly alarming and about as opposite away from, any kind of true transparency as you can possibly imagine, as Fauci's been cheating the public for 40 years and is just within a hair of getting prosecuted himself if the Republicans get back in charge in the fall. So, and that was a warning, actually, that Rand Paul gave out to Fauci, which I thought was particularly effective. That is, you better get ready because we're going to do this if we get back in. And what happened with Fauci? He resigned. He said, "Oh, it's time for me to retire. I'm going to get out." There's a lot with Fauci. Of course, RFK's book exposed him dramatically. The Real Dr. Fauci. And the book is remarkable. There's going to be a new edition of that. It's a bestseller, and RFK Jr. deserves incredible credit for exposing the kind of tainted background of this very sinister figure squatting in the middle of this op. So now for having them crisscross the op and having them put this Nolan immunologist professor character up front, promoting Fauci openly on Twitter in public, there's no mistaking it. You can go right to his Twitter feed and find it. So let's reflect for a moment how this CIA operation around the UFO file has worked. We know that Christopher Mellon was the big financier for TTSA, and that's Lou Elizondo in the middle, who they try to promote. They also tried DeLong, who turned into more of a Bobo figure and had to retreat, but kept the entertainment wing while they had that $50 million debt that they were getting from producing UFO shows and all the rest. Now, this thing's been going on since late. The New York Times ran the article December 16th, 2017. We did a complete overview of the players 4 years ago. I did that episode with Gigi Young, actually, and it's there. You can go to it January 1st, 2018. We laid out the players and laid out what they were up to, and it's taken 4 years, but now everybody's catching up on this, thank God, and seeing the nature of the op. It took too long, and basically we're coming up to 5 years where they just sucked all the oxygen out of the field, and you still have a lot of heavy-duty cultists around this. But basically what they tried to do on the CIA level was push through a UFO threat op. They tried to use the media and the New York Times to do it. And then they came out with this story that there was this disgruntled whistleblower who was quitting the Pentagon because he couldn't take it anymore. And that turned out to be our friend Lou, who we've covered extensively on this show. But what's interesting, and one of the things that we contended right off the bat, was that Lou never quit the government. He was a contractor, and he moved between different agencies. And now it's come out that he is working for Space Force. So this guy never left the government. That whole thing was a farce. The program ATIP was a farce. There's never been a paid program called ATIP. It's complete imaginary. And that's the program that he led, AATIP. Well, people like Greenwald went back there and were like, oh yeah, actually the program was OSAP. That was the funded thing. The other thing is just something that Lou said, well, it was an activity I got into. No funding, no government, anything. For all we know, he was playing darts. That's an activity. So we see there the foundation of fraud and the lies that were going on in public around this. And, there's no question about it. The next thing they try to move into was an aggressive phase with this guy after certain characters around TTSA fell apart, and they thought, we only have this guy left. And so they had him out there threatening people like the Black Vault and saying, well, actually, we're going to sue. And they had this lawyer there who was Kyle Rittenhouse's lawyer, sending out, these little things on Twitter like, oh, you better not say anything about my guy or that'll be, defamation or whatever, and trying to scare people off it. I mean, it really, that's the bottom of the barrel. That's Corey Goodland, and we've seen that before. But it does show that they were very concerned about that, and that this guy's become really a liability. And there are people familiar with counter intel. Actually, I'm referring to Walter Bosley, who did a public post about contractors. And he was talking about the UFO field, and he didn't mention Lou by name. But if you check that out, it's very interesting because he says, you can, in a certain point, you become a liability, and then the contracts, you start to scramble to make sure that you're still on the front page. And that's what we see happening. What I see happening with that is the Lou part is flaming out, and they have a lot of baggage there. He's fought with a lot of smaller channels, and he's got the red carpet treatment by the mainstream media because the CIA controls the PR of how that goes through. And the other thing about that is some of the people that I've pointed out who actually do good research in other ways, like the Tucker Carlsons of the world, they have dropped the ball because they don't know very much about the UFO file, and their staffers haven't been very good on that. So we've seen a lot of people like Megyn Kelly, Tucker, and CNN and all that, and they take it for granted. Well, this guy is, a UFO director and also, no. Look 1 inch deep and the whole thing falls apart. It's a CIA agent operating in the UFO space with counterintelligence background, means a professional liar, right? I mean, that's what it means. And, you have to be good at what you do. And sure, he's good at what he does, but we don't want that in the UFO field. That's the nature of the problem. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show tonight. We're going to go deep tonight into the eighth sphere crisis, and that includes the spiritual invasion of the Ahrimanic powers via the figure of Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy and spiritual science. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of the show. Before we do anything else, I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That's the thing that keeps us in touch with each other. And going forward, that's going to be very important because we've seen massive amounts of just incredible, really remarkable censorship, and around so many different sides of this, whether it's political, oh, you can't talk about that election, or the COVID op, oh, you can't talk about the COVID op, and people just being pushed around left and right. However, we've been able to kind of bring these shows to you, and it means the world to us that you guys support us out there. But if you are new to the program, make sure you sign up for that newsletter. And that's a free newsletter. You'll get it once a week. And it's not even that there's any marketing in there. It just lets you know the incredible X series shows that we have coming up for you, along with classic interviews this September. It'll blow your mind, some of the people who are coming on, and some documentary projects and events that are coming up this fall. You don't want to miss it, so stand up and be counted. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I'm going to tell you why I love the Ideas Room. Because we have comments like this from, I think it's Miko. Yeah. Has DJ seen the video of the guy who grew up in CERN from the Berkeley days? He said CERN obtained the mummified head of Osiris to attempt reconstructing a biotech archon body with his DNA.
Oh, yes. Well, let me tell you, look, first of all, admin@darkjournalist.com. Send the info away. There's been a lot of Osiris stuff in the mix around this Intel stuff, especially the 9 and all the rest. I haven't heard of Osiris's head being mixed up in this with CERN, but I do. I want to hear all about it. So make sure you get that going. And there's a piece with CERN, they just restarted it. And it's funny that you mentioned CERN, because I was working out some of these cards because I was thinking about some of the things. That's the Nikola Tesla card. And interestingly enough, they have Tesla as the King of Wands here. And then they have John von Neumann, who we know ran the UFO file, as the Death card. I thought that was interesting as well. Macy Conferences, this is the guy who created cybernetics, and we're looking at all the AI cyber stuff. And that's a good segue, actually, because before we go into the 8th sphere, I'm going to show the effects that are going on in our society in the 21st century that Steiner was warning about in 1920. And that whole anthroposophical wing coming out of Theosophy served a foundational purpose for so much of this. But I did want you to know that we're keeping a very close eye on the UFO threat operation, and we'll be doing regular reports on this. It's so important to raise the level of awareness around it. Unfortunately, all the UFO researchers have fallen down on the job on it. I don't know. I guess it must be kind of lucrative for their careers to do that, but you don't want to do that. And you don't want the CIA and Homeland Security censoring books because, amateur interest groups aren't able to talk about the UFO file because they're worried, if we're cooking up an op and these people are recording the real thing, then what? So we've got a real dangerous situation there, and very slippery if Fauci is being signaled as involved. And I'll tell you, when you have this guy that promoting Nolan, who they're promoting as like, he's the scientist who had his own UAP experiences, and he was abducted as a kid when he was a paper boy, all this stuff. This is the classic CIA junk. And we have to make sure that that whole junk conspiracy level does not go any further, because they've already gone pretty far on the threat front. And the way to diffuse the CIA UFO threat, which I think they want to trigger emergency powers, is literally to talk about it. You get the ideas from going on this, and watch out, because when people talk about it, the awareness level raises, and then the whole thing loses its magic, its spell, because, people know about it. They have to try something else, they have to blow up a building in order to do it. Okay. There's some more stuff around that UFO thing, but I'm going to leave it now and go into this piece about the after effects and why there's an 8th sphere crisis. I'm going to explain what I mean by that, and what we're looking at, and what the warning that Rudolf Steiner left behind through anthroposophy. And I believe he's vouchsafed some pieces there that the more I study it, the more it seems to me there's a kind of a legend or a time capsule theme of when he promised in 100 years this will all come back, and here we are in that 100-year window. Let's see how this all plays out. By the way, before I leave that CIA piece, the CIA has just been sued over the spying on journalists and lawyers who were visiting Assange. That's what you're talking about. A lawless agency who was planning assassination and were eavesdropping illegally on journalists. That's illegal. And the lawyers, of course, client attorney privilege. CIA doesn't care. They're just trying to get a certain type of result. Those are the people. And you definitely don't want those people in charge of the human origin story, the UFO file, or any of that, because you're dealing with some of the lowest scum of the earth right there. So what are we looking at with the rise of the eighth sphere crisis? What was it that was vouchsafed for us? So in the middle of all of the things that are going on, we have headlines like the rise of microchipping. Are we ready for technology to get under the skin? And, they want that level of control. They're already trying to control that everybody has an electric vehicle so they can shut it off and they can redirect it and pilot that thing. So the whole thing is to strip autonomy from the global citizens. And they're going to have bigger problems with it in certain parts of the world than in others. But this thing is moving forward with no debate, and it's moving forward with no consulting the citizens, no votes, nothing. And that whole idea emanating really from a small group of very well-placed people who have incredible powers, but are also benefiting from the fact that they have incredible influence with the media, and the media doesn't want to touch them. Now, the thing is, the independent media has been opening up a lot of these ideas. And what happens is, the independent media becomes the big problem. Well, how do you shut the independent media up? Well, you can sort of create a false flag thing if you're Stepford Biden, and you just say, oh, that MAGA is so terrible. We need to, oh, they did a false flag. There's an operation that went on, and we need to shut down so they can't communicate with each other. We have to really line those people up. And so the imagery that they're putting across is that dictator style imagery, the martial law imagery. So certainly they positioned that for the fall, in my opinion, on purpose. And of course, if you're left, right, or whatever, the idea of scapegoating any voting population as a president is just sick. I mean, the whole thing is the president of the whole country, and the idea that you can sort of pull out one group the way that Hillary did in 2016 and say, aha, these deplorables, they're so terrible, sounds a lot like the playbook that they had with Justin Trudeau when the trucker convoy came and was like, hey, you're not going to control our lives. And he said, these people, they must be racist and misogynist. Should we tolerate these people? No. Press the emergency button. This is a prelude to what they want to move in. And the idea is, they're suffering because they only have a very small slice of the electorate. In Biden's case, barely 30%, and mostly just because people are traditional Democrats that they would support. The same thing with Trudeau, 22% support. Nobody wants these people in here running things. But they've been able to, through the emergency powers, through the emergency situations, create these situations where with very little background support, they're able to use the emergency powers, but they want to use them in an all-out fashion. So microchipping is a handy way to control people and also to convince them, hey, this is good for you because, it'll help your blood pressure or something. You can find your pets. Okay. Now, robots, they have this whole piece in here from the World Economic Forum. Robots will perform more tasks than humans by 2025. That's right around the corner. We got 2 years on that. Robots will handle 52% of current work tasks by 2025, almost twice as many as now. A World Economic Forum study said the sharp increase could also see a net gain in new roles for humans. Yeah, in cages as pets. The sharp increase, new roles for humans who will have to revamp skills to keep pace with the seismic shift, quote, unquote, in how we work with machines and computer programs, the forum estimated. This is very interesting to me because, I'm sure they're exaggerating those numbers, just like they used to say, oh, God, 80% of everyone's getting vaccinated. Isn't that great? And I think it was more like around 30%. And I think that's why they were pushing so hard. And they would just be like, oh, we've got 82%, but we need 100. It was more like, no, you got 30% and you're not getting to 50. So there's a number promotion thing, and they're just with the robot piece. It's like, oh, the robots are here. They're already doing it. It's already over 50%. Just forget about it. Forget about that job. We're going to retrain you, to praise our green agenda.
What year did they get for that?
No, that's supposed to be right now. 2025 is when they'll have more. But right now, they're saying that's already on the rise. So the estimate takes us to 2025. So, basically they're saying in 3 years they've got it. Now, let's put some stats together and think about this. You got microchips, you got small groups controlling these things. We have the whole warning about the eighth sphere very early on, this echo coming back to us 100 years later. Now let's look at U.S. life expectancy at birth, which has gone down dramatically over the last few years. Let's find out why, shall we? Okay, that's the actual chart, just so you know where we're coming from. And this is reported widely across the media, and it comes from the National Center for Health Statistics. But one of the more shocking elements from life expectancy data released earlier this week by the CDC was just how much some racial and ethnic groups saw their expected lifespan shorten. And this is very, very interesting because we have now Asians in America have the longest U.S. life expectancy at 83.5 years. Hispanics have gone down 77.7 years. White Americans, 76.4, which is a dramatic decrease of 3 years. Black Americans, 70.8, a major decrease. And the most decrease, the largest decrease is American Indians, Alaska Natives, 65.2 years old. And they've gone down some 6 points over the last decade. And only now driving the news, American Indians and Alaska Natives saw their life expectancy fall 6.5 years in the first 2 years of the pandemic. Okay, now, so much of the things that we're talking about in terms of death stats, they want to attribute, and they, oh, was it COVID this and COVID that? No, first of all, we know that people were getting tremendous amounts of money for reporting COVID deaths from their hospital through Medicare and all the rest. So the actual numbers, you're never going to know. And we also know that there's a strange unknown cause of death going around as an after effect of all this stuff. And who wants to bet that that's related to the pharmaceutical push? So those numbers are very intentionally placed there, and they are lowering actual life expectancy, interestingly enough. Now, it's interesting too when we look at this. So we have this idea that, hey, robots are going to take your jobs. Hey, your life expectancy is going down. Hey, we're going to microchip you. Hey, you're going to be digitally controlled to do what we want you to do, and you're going to have an electric car where you want one or not. They announced in California with Gavin Newsom, crazy martial law Gavin Newsom, who announced, I can call martial law if I want to. No, it's a little thing called the Constitution tells you can't do that. And he was really like one of the true psychopaths, along with Greta in Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan and Greta, I guess. But you have to give Greta some slack. She's a kid, right? When I think about this, the situation, though, it goes round and round, and they're trying to promote this guy as a presidential candidate because Stepford Biden ain't going to make it in 2024. And so he said, I'm announcing, this is Newsom now, I'm announcing that by 2035, no one can sell a gasoline car in California. So you can't drive, no gasoline cars. But at the same time, he's saying, hey, we're having like energy problems. Stop charging your cars and stop using your air conditioning. Where is that situation going to go? It just does not add up. So this is the nature of the society that they're trying to bring on. What we're going to try to do tonight is quite extraordinary. We're going to try to bring ourselves into the consciousness of the public mystery schools giving us this warning 100 years out to face the situation that we've arrived at, find ourselves in the middle of an eighth sphere crisis and basically a spiritual invasion by these Ahrimanic forces. How do these things logically fit in? How are we able to compute after, having relative stability here as a nation for so many years to move into the situation around the world where we have to contemplate, oh, there's an occult group who's moving in eighth sphere rules through our technology. Think about this. But there is a warning that this is going to take place, and there are tools that are left. And we're going to enter into the mind of Steiner leaving us this information about Ahriman and the eighth sphere tonight. And when we go into his mindset about it, it's gonna reveal some things that we didn't know before. And before we do that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Rendella Wenzel says, this is more important than ever with AI and transhumanism. And Holy Fool says, are we already trapped in the eighth sphere?
I mean, they're setting the trap, you know. I mean, and I'm someone who's worked in technology for years. I know it very well, and I don't have any, I don't have an allergic reaction to us moving forward dramatically with technology. But what they did was they took the promise of the whole thing, the idea that, you know, we could increase our productivity and creativity and freedom and all the rest, and that we could cut down our work week and all the rest. And they've advanced wars, you know, the war in Ukraine, they've raised the nuclear threat, they've taken away freedoms, they violated the Constitution. And this they've all done through the mechanism of the technology, but they want to go much further than they've been able to go. And so that's really the key piece that we're looking at here. Where are they going with this? And by they, I do mean the left-hand schools that are controlling so much of this. And I can tell you from observing people in those lines that they're incredibly influential, and that they are already mapping things out a good 10 years in advance from here. So in order to upset the apple cart and the train ride that's happening, we're going to need to know what's been left for us, what kind of tools we have in relation to this, working on that school level. The mystery schools, as we've laid out, there's two sides to those schools and maybe multiple within those two sides. But at least we know there's a right-hand path school and a left-hand path school. And when we get into the level of influence of those secret societies, they're very well matched knowledge-wise, but they have very different ideas about moving the culture in a particular direction. And certainly there's one group that is trying to advance the culture. And there's another group who is interested in capturing a whole spiritual dynamic in relation to humanity. So the more that we expose that aspect and get a handle on it, the better off we are. So let's get into what Steiner was talking about. What is the eighth sphere crisis that I've been referring to here? Before I do, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Frank Monday says, China is the eighth sphere supercharged. Brenda Fisher says the digital prison will be sold to the masses under the banner of convenience. And Charles Wagner says they want literal slaves. Usury isn't enough. They want your soul.
Absolutely. Well,
they're getting it.
Yeah, I think that people who live in China are particularly aware of what's happening there. It is quite interesting that there are a number of mystery school references to if America would fail in its role, that the leadership, unfortunately, would move east. And this is kind of a scary notion when you think about what's been going on in relation to China. In some of the things I've been reading about Steiner lately, he actually was talking about something quite different, about how the next big wave of leadership after America would come out of Eastern Europe. So when we see the things that are going on in Ukraine and the desperate attempts to control that aspect, Ukraine, Russia become very important to looking at this entire matter. There are also comments by Steiner talking about that weird piece that the East might pick up the baton if we drop it. And unfortunately, you know, in America, we've seen a dramatic deep state controlling things globally. But China, as we've learned, is just, you know, there's no freedom there, and grabbing their citizens for social media posts and social credit scores and the kind of draconian dictator levels aren't even like communist controls. This is more like Nazi control that they have over their citizens there. So the people are wonderful, you know, and the Chinese people add so much to us in our own history. But unfortunately, the governments, you know, just like we have in America, are completely upside down. And I don't see a lot of hope there. So I don't see them as suited to leading the world at all. You know, you're not going to switch out America for China and get something better. So we need to figure out how this plays out and why there is that thing in the mystery school predictions about if America fails. And is America failing? Well, certainly on certain levels, we are. And if we lose some of those fundamental constitutional bedrocks, like free speech, like the Second Amendment, and all the rest, and we've been losing a lot.
No, the only way we have the First Amendment is because we have the Second.
Absolutely.
Right now.
So this is, yeah, and that's exactly what they're describing. So they don't, you know, they laid those rules down there as kind of ironclad, and those aren't the things that can be messed with. And we've seen what happens when you give up speech and you give up your guns in other countries. They just roll over you, like they, you know, are trying to do in Canada, like they've done in Australia, like they did in China, you know, under Mao, and so on. That's just a pattern we've seen throughout history, and we saw it with Hitler as well. Everyone had to turn in their guns, and you know, they had to suspend the press and all the rest. And you know, he got in under emergency powers. We've seen this script. He even called you know, Germany the homeland, right? And now they're trying to get everyone in the habit of calling America, the United States of America, a homeland. Forget about it. If Northcom commander comes forward and says, you know, this or that about homeland, the people who are asking him questions at a press conference should say, do you mean the United States of America? You know, it's the United States of America. It's not homeland. Homeland is nothing. It has no legal title. It's not, you know, it's bizarro world. Homeland security, again, you know, they're up. It's not United States security. They're under a weird umbrella where there's no constitution apparently, and there's warrantless wiretaps and all the rest. So, you know, I've made the point. We can't have Homeland Security and the CIA running the UFO file. That's the end. You know, so call that stuff out while we can. All right. So before we start on the eighth sphere, I have a very interesting quote. It comes out of Ouspensky, which is another piece of the mystery schools, of course, incredible fourth way work. But somehow it's related to this episode, and it comes from one of these tarot cards. There's a big tarot theme in here tonight, which is the Wheel of Fortune. And there's a fantastic book that's overlooked often in relation to Ouspensky, because people really think of his work, I think, as Tertia Morganum and the Gurdjieff work. But he did a wonderful meditation on all the tarot cards and what they meant. And here's his meditation on the Wheel of Fortune. Card X, incidentally. I walked along, absorbed in deep thought, trying to understand the vision of the angel, and suddenly, as I lifted my head, I saw midway in the sky a huge revolving circle, covered with Kabbalistic letters and symbols. The circle turned with terrible velocity, and around it, falling down and flying up, symbolic figures of the serpent and the dog revolved. Above it sat an immovable sphinx. In clouds on the four quarters of heaven, I saw four apocalyptical beings, one with the face of a lion, another with the face of a bull, the third with the face of an eagle, and the fourth with the face of a man. And each of them read an open book, and I heard the voices of Zarathustra's beasts. All go, all return. The wheel of life ever turns. All die, all flourish again. The year of existence runs eternally. All perish, all live again. The same house of existence is ever building. All separate, all meet again. The ring of existence is ever true to itself. And finally, existence begins at every moment. Round each here rolls there. The middle is everywhere. The way to eternity is a curve. That is Ouspensky on the Wheel of Fortune, giving us some insight about the period that we're in and how we're in a turn. And this has happened before, and here we are moving into it again. One of the interesting things when we consider Steiner's work is just how unusual it is when it comes out, because we've had anthroposophy, yes, and anthroposophy sets it up, especially the fact that he took part in anthroposophy for a decade before creating spiritual science. But nonetheless, the Steiner work is very different, ultimately. And it relies far more on his ability to use his intellect operational with his knowledge of the spiritual world. And in that sense, we have someone who's a scholar who really comes back with all this knowledge from the spiritual realm. A number of unusual early experiences for Steiner, including seeing discarnate entities. I remember there's one story about him being 10 years old, and he's in a cabin and he sees a woman go into the oven, and then he sees her again and she's trying to talk to him, but she's basically a ghost. And he finds out later that she is a relative who disappeared. And obviously there's some suggestion there that it was in relation to this whole situation, and they covered it up. But it's a very disturbing incident for him, talking with the ghost. Steiner also encounters this gardener named Felix, who, although he's kind of an illiterate, is an incredible spiritual master and is someone who guides him along the early way of understanding his own visions. And this will eventually lead to his spiritual awakening and the idea of him meeting a Rosicrucian master at a certain point and suddenly understanding all the incredible visions that he's had growing up. Interestingly enough, although he became a truly brilliant scholar, Steiner in early school didn't do too well. And it was very interesting because as soon as he discovered geometry, he became an ace student. It's giving you some idea of those incredible perceptions that he had early on. Steiner revered and had great respect for the Theosophical movement when it started, and he wanted to join it, and he did. And at the time, what was going on there in 1875 is that this real deep scientific materialism had taken over. And Theosophy had come along through the figure of Helena Blavatsky and given us totally different read on the situation, including all these concepts along the lines of reincarnation and psychic ability, mediumship, and really cementing these hardcore mysteries, coming out with a book in 1877 called Isis Unveiled, and then eventually The Secret Doctrine. And there had never been books like this that were out in public in that era. That was just unheard of. And there were echoes and there were all kinds of things that happened through the Middle Ages, but this was something that came in just whew, and no one knew who Blavatsky was, and no one knew anything about Theosophy either. And what happens is she goes through a number of unusual experiences coming from Russia and being a woman, but she's a deep psychic who links up with a master from one of these mystery schools, and she travels around the world gaining experience and knowledge around these things. And by the time she lands in 1875, the person that she meets up with in New York City is Henry Olcott. And Olcott is very interesting because he's a retired general who's doing all these very popular articles on spiritualism for the New York Times. And interestingly enough, in his former role, he was one of the guys, he was a general under Abraham Lincoln. And he's one of the guys who will participate in basically a version of the Warren Commission, because there were all these questions around Lincoln's assassination, which didn't sit right. And he was on this board trying to figure out what actually happened in that assassination. So when he meets her, it's a very unusual meeting. And he takes her to this house in Vermont where there are all these happenings going on. And people are having these kind of very spooky incidents with ghosts and apparitions and seances and things. And it's called the Eddy House. And when Blavatsky shows up, all the intensity of the action increases dramatically. And suddenly there are all these different types of visions that come through. And very often they look like these ascended masters. It has a decidedly Eastern quality. Blavatsky herself describes her life as being a concert pianist and going around the world as a concert pianist and having these incredible esoteric happenings. She came from a very kind of highbrow family there in Russia. And she married a military man at the age of 18 and then ran away. And that's how she got into her globetrotting aspect. And she would go to Tibet and learn these secrets by working through these different groups. And it was very particularly interesting because she had been predicted by different mystery schools. They knew she was coming. So this was a character that they kept an eye on all the way through. And by the time Steiner gets his hand on theosophy, concepts like the eighth sphere have already come out. You know, concepts around Atlantis, concepts around reincarnation and all this have come out through theosophy. They've already covered the ground. And what's going to happen is that Steiner is going to refine some of the work that they do and then expand it into something totally unique. But what's happening early on with the eighth sphere is that there's somebody who comes out of theosophy early on who's a journalist from a banking family that gets very enamored of Blavatsky, and he is AP Senate, and she encourages him that he's very psychic and that he should try to write about these ideas. And as he does, he gets contacted by a master, Mahatma, and he writes Esoteric Buddhism. Now, she has a lot of regard for him, but in Esoteric Buddhism, you'll find letters later with her chiding him about a number of things that he got wrong. And one of the things that she's absolutely livid with him about is talking about the eighth sphere. Now, the eighth sphere, according to Steiner, was one of the most major secrets. At one point, he said something that made it sound like it was the top secret that the mystery schools had. And the idea being that there was a sphere that was in development that was being controlled by dark astral forces that were developing this for the purposes of controlling humanity. And it operated almost as a kind of a cosmic soul evolution piece. And in the cosmology of anthroposophy, he refers to the eighth sphere, and I'm going to read his direct quotes on it. This is just the short capsule version. But he refers to it as something that sounds like a virtual reality zone, the same way that we're creating and falling into these virtual realities. And we hear about things like metaverse. These things are such a setup for what Steiner was predicting out there that reading it is eerie because it's 100 years ago, but it reads like it's happening now. And when we look at what they're trying to do in things like the metaverse, is they're supposed to, you're supposed to take your consciousness on a vacation and live in this other weird world where you have an identity and meet all these people. And, we've had a lot of that with the internet anyway, right? And a lot of people pretending they're not who they are. But it's very interesting with the metaverse. There's a lot of investment going on, and people are actually buying space in the metaverse, believe it or not. So it's basically, you could describe it as vacuuming up humanity into these virtual realms. And once in the virtual realms, they fall under the control of the realm. And Steiner's warning is that the Ahrimanic forces will become so powerful during the 21st century that there's a very real possibility that they could upset the entire spiritual evolution that's been laid out from the beginning. And that the Ahrimanic forces, the way he describes them, have been with us for a long time. And that this is basically what we understand as the devil, the roots of evil. It goes into interesting territory once we hit the 21st century, because Ahriman seems to be describing that this thing needs to come through the technology. And that it's not, when he talks about it having an incarnation of Ahriman, it sounds very much like we're talking about the incarnation of a cyborg. Whereas earlier when he says, we had the incarnation of Christ, and that set so many things back for the Ahrimanic forces. And we had an incarnation of Lucifer, but these are physical incarnations. The incarnation of Ahriman sounds very much like this is something that merges with mineral matter, and then we got this being occupying a kind of cyborg. So as a result of this, the what was going on in 1840, when all of this spiritual materialism was at its height, was a war of the mystery schools took place. And in that war of the mystery schools, there was a group that didn't want to allow anything to come out and liked the fact that they had maintained the secrecy over so many years and passed it down through so many different mystery schools, and had kept this sacred knowledge. But there was another group, and it was a visionary group that had the ability for clairvoyance and looked 100 years in the future and said, they're not going to be human anymore. Like, what's the point? You know, they're going to lose their humanity completely. We have to let things out about these mystery school secrets. And so there's a large scale battle that takes place. And so some of the pops and clicks that take place have to do with spiritualism, mediumship, table rapping, and all of these interesting things of, you know, communication with the spirit realm, which was such a craze during the Civil War, actually. And we have people coming out like the Poughkeepsie Seer, and we have the Fox sisters, and they are engaged on levels of exploration, and that kind of esoteric exploration that's talking about, well, we visited Summerland, we went to this other world, and, you know, we saw ghosts, we saw our relatives who had passed on, and they told us how they were living now, just like they had lived here. And it's a huge explosion of this kind of thing. And suddenly everyone wants to talk to their dead relatives, including President Lincoln, by the way, and his wife, which is how they meet one of the founders of Theosophy. And that is Emma Britton. And Emma Britton will be one of the people who founds the Theosophical Society with Helena Blavatsky. And we've covered her in a few shows, and her coming out of the Orphic Circle Mystery School in England, and some of the very interesting things that they did using her as a somnambulist clairvoyant. And some of the really high-level people like Benjamin Disraeli, Charles Dickens, and other people who were members of this Orphic Circle. But back to Steiner and the Eighth Sphere, what we have is he's understanding, and one of the things I like to put across when I look at Steiner's work is that it seems to me that he spent 4 decades trying to tell us about 2 things in particular, even with all of his research. I believe he was trying to tell us, one, about the Eighth Sphere and how it has this tremendous impact for the 21st century. But the other thing I think he was trying to tell us about was the Ahrimanic force. So if I said he spent 4 decades trying to get this message across, the question is, how well do we understand it now? And so many people have discovered Steiner's Ahriman work, either through the X series or through G.G. Young's work, which has been remarkable on this. And some people were aware of it certainly before, but there's something about this period of bringing it forward that's really opening it up a lot. And I see people who are like, you know, I touched on Steiner's stuff like 20 years ago, and I didn't quite understand what was going on. And now I'm back to it, and it's like opening up like a revelation to me. I see people catching on to anthroposophy and Steiner's work through so many different channels. Now, if you follow anthroposophy, of course, you find that Steiner isn't someone just with a lot of spiritual books out there. He developed anthroposophy. He developed biodynamic farming. He developed eurythmy. All of that biodynamic wines that you're seeing, that's all Steiner. So he had his own theater groups. You know, this is somebody, and of course the Waldorf schools, which is early childhood education. So we're looking at somebody who's having a large scale effect in all these different areas, coming directly out of this mystery school influence. So when we get that in our head of how clear those links are with the mystery school influence on humanity and how they're moving the culture forward, not even bothering to take a bow or take credit, just to get things rolling in the right direction. Steiner, if you really study him, is right in the heart of that. But his message for the 21st century is particularly on target. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here tonight on the work of Rudolf Steiner, and it is the Eighth Sphere Crisis, the Ahrimanic spiritual invasion. What is it all about? We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program tonight. And Miss Olivia, before I go any further, what do you got?
Brian D says in Dante's Inferno, Circle 8, the eighth pit is for those who are considered counselors of fraud and brought about the downfall of others. They intentionally misled others for their own gain with lies. And Flash Gordon says the eighth sphere is the metaverse trap. There's a lot of discussion of the metaverse.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, I referred to it as virtual reality for a long time, but the metaverse is sort of the ultimate version of that, because it's trying to, confront you with the idea that you can operate in this other reality and be a big success and spend all this money and have all this joy outside of your body into this realm. And we've seen that whole thing about avatars. And we heard the comments from the SpaceX founder, Elon Musk, as well, talking about how he could transform his conscious cube, and then they could leave that cube on a planet or whatever. In sense, anyone on that level studied anything about the mysteries, then they know that you can't put your consciousness anywhere. Your consciousness is related directly to your physiology. And so that thing they call the silver cord, pituitary, Leydig, and pineal gland, that has to be, you have to be in operation with that connected to your body to go and do all these things astrally. So the idea that you're going to be in a cube somewhere just doesn't cut it if you know anything about the mysteries. So it's strange even that they would suggest the hints around the eighth sphere. And when they, a lot of the recruiting messages for space are pretty interesting. I've been noticing from Space Force and from others and from SpaceX saying, well, you never really fit in on Earth, right? Always felt like you didn't fit on Earth. Well, get into the space program. Space, the way that it was envisioned is very interesting, because there were very lofty ideals in the development of the space program. It was for science. They got everybody in a treaty very early on saying, we're not going to put weapons in space and all the rest. And John F. Kennedy made that, he said, it is really something where, we're going to explore it together. And he created plans to do that with Russia. And what we got instead was an arms race around this, a secret space program, and now all these dynamics that are going on about militarizing space. And, where does that go? Nuking the moon. I mean, how far do you want to take this, gentlemen? So we can see that we're in quite a mess in relation to that. But again, that mystery school influence giving us a real hint of what the cosmos is about and how the planets relate to our individual lives and how that is wrapped up in humanity's destiny, including New Jupiter. So we're going to get to this part now. Before I jump into that, Miss Olivia, one more.
Frank Monday says, the philosophy of the eighth sphere is nihilism. Its religion is atheism, and its manifestation is modern Chinese system of social credit. Sad, very sad.
Oh, well, there's a lot of truth to that. Although I think when you think about atheism, I don't think atheism is required to be in that eighth sphere. Certainly it makes you vulnerable to it, but you also could be caught up in a false belief, for example, belief in Ahriman and the things that Ahriman is bringing. So
you mean you could worship Ahriman?
Exactly. And so there's different entry points.
Actually, that makes it, you make a good point, is that it's actually very difficult to be a true atheist, because people all are naturally putting their faith in something external.
Interesting.
Something, someone, some entity. There's something, some power outside of themselves. There's the whole utopian urge that we're seeing now towards transhumanism and AI and all this. This is a religion of sort. It's like a cult, right?
I think there's a lot of atheism in the World Economic Forum types. And we've seen them brag about that openly, like, forget about God, we're in charge. But you also see, people like Schwab, and of course we only have figureheads, right? Even Gates is kind of a figurehead on this, some of the deeper aspects. So we'll talk about these people and who they refer back to rather than just thinking of them as individuals. But some of those people strike me, especially from the research that we've done around the hot zone piece. And we know that Epstein and Maxwell were very involved in this. But the cult of Belial, that aspect of the Ahriman piece, locked up there in the Atlantean ruins, locked up in that Atlantean history. So that's not an atheism, right? It's a kind of worship of a dark astral place and a dark astral source. So it's very interesting when we think about those terms, and so the different roads that get you sort of stuck in the eighth sphere. Sculpture that Steiner did of Ahriman himself, and I've shown this before. It's so interesting, the reactions to this, but fundamentally, Steiner put himself in a state in order to be able to actually envision Ahriman. And this is what he came out with. This is his own sculpture, which is quite dramatic. And he had to do it quickly because he felt the longer he worked on it, the more in concrete he felt like he was operating. So the more he concentrated on Ahriman, the more in a kind of a deep, heavy reality he was in because of the density of this being. And one of the things that Steiner had mentioned about Ahriman is he wanted to turn the world into a gigantic deep freeze, which I found interesting. This is interesting when we think about the Ahrimanic source, because we don't know much about this. This term comes to us out of the Persian mythology, and we have all sorts of things there with the twin of Ahriman and the good twin, Ahura Mazda, the Christ-like figure coming in and doing battle nonstop with this ferocious, chimerical Ahriman, which doesn't look anything like what Steiner portrayed. Steiner was giving us something with this naming of Ahriman, and also separating out what we understood as evil between two different forces, Luciferian evil and Ahrimanic evil, and how we had to address them in two very different ways. So his description, his cosmology there, whether you agree with it or not, is very interesting and unique in that he's giving us two forces of evil, and here's the description of each. And the Ahrimanic was more of a scientific, technological plotting to cut off humanity from its spirit, because you can only, things that are weighed, things that are measured, this is the only thing that is going to be truth. This is going to be your reality. The Luciferian and the Lucifer beings, their interaction with humanity had all sorts of different ups and downs, but they were also associated with things like the arts. And their idea was to pull the head and the mind of humanity out of the body, off into the eighth sphere with them. And the Ahrimanic powers are to degrade the humanity down to such a level on Earth that they are basically waste product for the eighth sphere, and they're locked into a fantasy. Now, both of those are very interesting, but they're very different, because on one side you have something kind of tempting you away from your body through ideas. And what's interesting is Steiner also makes some very unusual references about our early history with the Luciferic beings, that we learned things from them, and that the whole idea with facing off against evil is to learn from it, not to just run away from it, but to face up to it and learn. And so that's what we see in his description around Ahriman and Lucifer. Let's get right to the quotes from Steiner on this, about the situation that we're in and the eighth sphere crisis, and how Ahriman and Lucifer fit in with that reality. He was pretty bold to put it on the record for decades. Let's find out what he was talking about. This actually, one of the great things that Steiner did was he wanted to cover Blavatsky's legacy, because so many people were giving her a hard time after the fact of her dying, and Theosophy went into a very strange tailspin, trying to promote Krishnamurti as a savior and all these things that happened after the fact. But he actually found that there were true initiates at the cradle of Theosophy, and that she was definitely an atavistic master herself. And so you find tremendous reverence and respect for Blavatsky in Steiner's work, although he recognizes that she had been manipulated and kept in a kind of psychic imprisonment, which we're going to get to. Let's get to this lecture. It's lecture 5 in the occult movement, on the occult movement in the 19th century. Miss Olivia, before I jump in? What do you got?
Steiner to God says, could Ahriman be incarnated in quantum computing, particularly what people refer to as the quantum internet, which has very disturbing capabilities, controlling thoughts, etc.? Right, Geordie Rose talks about this.
Yes, absolutely. I'll tell you what's a really good source on that is the work of Ilana Freeland. And she sent me so much really interesting information, but her book on her latest book on geoengineering is just incredible. And it understands the spiritual implications as well, but it tells you what the nanotech is capable of doing. But one of the chips that they have, they have to keep it, one of those quantum computing machines, they have to keep it in such a deep freeze. And when they bring it out, they have these scientists almost praying to this thing and revering it like a god, as we've seen some of that language with CERN as well. And, it's like they're at the altar of science and they expect this god to come through. So there's definitely a kind of unholy worship of what's taking place there. But that is very interesting. I would keep an eye on that. Steiner's mention about the eighth sphere. Remember that A.P. Sinnott had brought it up in 1884. So it's already been out there now almost 30 years. And Steiner addresses it to fix the problem. It's very difficult indeed, he says, to speak about the so-called eighth sphere, which was referred to openly for the first time by A.P. Sinnott. One cannot say that he gave information about it, for what he said was a fallacy. This is the other problem with the eighth sphere, which is not only did Sinnott bring it up and it was a mystery secret, but he also told it wrongly. So now that created a whole scramble among these schools about a very great secret that had got out, and also that it had got out with the wrong information attached to it. And this wave of materialism again came in his explanation of it. Sinnott would tie the eighth sphere to the moon, which has nothing to do with it. We're going to find out that the eighth sphere can only be apprehended by humanity using clairvoyant vision. And that's very important for us to realize. However, it does have a physical manifestation. So it's both. You can certainly realize why it's difficult to speak about this subject. Again, back to the Steiner lecture. For again, it must be emphasized that our language has been coined for the outer material world, and the eighth sphere was regarded as a secret matter until it was mentioned by Sinnott. This is something that was inside the walls of the mystery schools. It did not have any public place. It was not discussed. The fact that all mention was avoided for so long will also enable you to realize what is involved when one speaks of it. You'll therefore have to take the aphoristic remarks I shall make today as a kind of introductory exposition. Given that the subject is throwing out certain indications which to begin with can only be a small contribution on the subject, it is to be hoped, however, that there'll be opportunities for saying more at some later time on the basis of what was said in the last lecture, and also to some extent on earlier occasions. I'll try to characterize what is called the eighth sphere in order that we may have a foundation for describing the development of the spiritual movement in the 19th century. Steiner lived 9 more years beyond this lecture, and I believe he did get a green light to talk further about the eighth sphere. We're still left with the great question around the eighth sphere, but I think Steiner has given us a great deal. Here's a little more. You'll have realized from the lecture yesterday that the eighth sphere cannot be anything that belongs to the material world, for I've shown you that the greatest fallacy in Sinnott's statement that the physical moon is directly connected with the eighth sphere, and I try to make it comprehensible, that the actual foundation of the error consists in the fact that this was pointed to something material and physical. From this, you'll be able to conjecture, even if not fully to understand, that what is called the eighth sphere can have nothing directly to do with anything within the material world. That is to say, what can be perceived by man's senses and thought out on the basis of sensory perception has no part in the eighth sphere. So it will be useless to look for the eighth sphere anywhere in the material world. We're looking at a spiritual manifestation. You now have indications by means of which some approach can be made in thought to a conception of the eighth sphere. I've said that the eighth sphere is sometimes to do with the residue left from the old moon and its evolution. That's a piece of the Steiner cosmology. So much you can gather from the studies we've pursued in the course of time. I tried to make it clear that the lecture yesterday on the old moon, man's natural mode of perception was visionary and imaginative in character, so that any substantiality to be discerned in the eighth sphere must be found with this kind of vision. That is to say, it must be presumed at the outset that the eighth sphere is found by way of visionary imagination. You're going to have to go through the visionary aspect of your psychic mind to apprehend anything about this. Now, what had happened, interestingly enough, is, as I said, when The Secret about the Eighth Sphere came out, Sinnott got a real dress down by Blavatsky. It was like, you can't talk about this. You know that, so if you got this information, you're not supposed to be talking about it. She was aware of it. But interestingly enough, in the middle of all that, she herself was trying to get into the American brotherhoods, and they didn't want to admit her because, one, she was a woman, and two, because she was Russian. So the mystery schools in America had become tied over directly with the political process. And interestingly enough, in the Transcendental Universe, C.G. Harrison, who talks all about this mystery school period and the battles back and forth, refers to the fact that they had considered Blavatsky as somebody who was violating the Constitution. So they had any excuse that they could to keep her out of the mystery schools in America. Steiner had said that the mystery schools were so intertwined with the political process that all the mystery schools on the right side and on the left side controlled the entire political process in America, down to the elected officials. So all those people have to be on board one way or another. And somehow this woman coming in 1875 to America from Russia, even though they knew her atavistic character of mediumship and her high psychic ability, they regarded her as a threat. And so what she did, which was probably not such a good thing to do, is she threatened basically to do what Sinnott did, but consciously. And she said that she was going to let certain secrets out about the American Brotherhood to its counterpart in France. And so apparently we have a push-pull there with France, UK, and America. There's something going on between those schools that they don't operate on by the same rules. And as a result of this, we have the situation of Blavatsky entering into a psychic imprisonment, so that all of her psychic visions and interactions with the Mahatmas and the ascended masters got distorted through this process of a magical rite. So I think it's important when we get into this to understand that these people operate just like we were talking about with Stepford Biden and the bizarre ritual from the other night. Everything from 9/11 to the JFK assassination in American politics has this esoteric rite, this occult rite attached to it. And that is the working of the left-hand schools. So when we see things like we saw the other night, we know that the left-hand schools are gearing up for some activity. And what's interesting is you see a lot of people reporting after that and after the Biden show with all the strange fascist imagery. And you see even reporters who normally don't freak out had very strong reactions to that visual. And, the crazy thing is, because Biden is so simple-minded and his brain doesn't operate properly, the terror of the situation is that puppet in office with the people who arranged this rite, pushing him up there, that's the danger of the situation, which is we can't even see who's the puppeteer on this. And I think that we're getting that feeling, that sense that there is an occult practice at work in imagery of that nature. And so what Steiner is getting at with this is very interesting, going all the way back to what happened with Blavatsky and how she got thrown off her track. She's placed in this psychic occult imprisonment. And here is the description from C.G. Harrison's book of what that is, that Steiner quotes when he's talking about the occult imprisonment that she was put into. So Steiner's very aware of Harrison and his work. But Harrison, again, is giving his lectures in 1890. So that's a good 10 years before Steiner's on the scene. Steiner had academic works around Goethe and things like that, but he's not out there talking theosophy until 1902. So something is going on there. There's a group in England called the Berean Society. That's Berean, which is kind of like a mystery school gathering. And Harrison, which is a fake name, goes forward and gives a series of lectures to these people about everything that happened. Well, here's what happened with Blavatsky. Here's what happened with the Eighth Sphere conversation. Here's what happened with psychic imprisonment. And Steiner goes back and he finds Harrison's remarks and quotes them. So there's a string here of people reporting publicly on private mystery school activities. And I've pointed this out before about Harrison. It's almost like he's a frontline journalist reporting on these mystery school wars. But here's what he has to say. What is occult imprisonment and why was it inflicted on Madame Blavatsky? There's a certain operation of ceremonial magic by means of which a wall of psychic influences may be built up around an individual who has become dangerous, which has the effect of paralyzing the higher activities and producing what is called the repercussion of effort. And the result is a kind of spiritual sleep characterized by fantastic visions. It is an operation seldom resorted to even by brothers of the left. And in the case of Madame Blavatsky, was disapproved of by almost all European occultists. On the American Brotherhoods alone rests the responsibility for what has since happened. Very interesting, and again, gives us that eye over into what was taking place in relation to the mystery schools. This is what the same author, Harrison, had to say about the Eighth Sphere and what it is and why releasing that information was bad. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight on Steiner's message around the Eighth Sphere crisis and Ahriman. We're going to be taking your questions shortly here. I'm running over as usual, Miss Olivia.
It's all good.
How are your questions going?
Great.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll take them shortly. And let's see how much of this I can get in.
While you're doing that, have another sip. Kellyanna says, all of this is one big ritual, John Dee's world. And Frank Monday says, the best way to counter black magic and mass hypnosis gaslighting is to be heart-centered and commune with the divine, encourage community, oppose tyranny, and protect and guide your children.
Yeah.
Who can disagree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes down, it's very interesting because there are a lot of descriptions in Steiner's work about how the mind is being controlled by Ahriman and how it's being captured and how it's being taught this scientific materialism to overrule its spiritual impulses. But it's hard. It keeps longing for a much deeper expression of that spiritual growth. So there's a real conflict coming out of the 19th century, which leads us to these public mystery schools. The thing is, what they set up for us was to take all this information and play it out over a certain period of time. And from what I get, and this is just my own observation, but it seems to me the mystery schools are looking at all the things that are laid out there and wondering, how did the society pick up on them? You know, how did we do with Steiner's work? How did we do with the Gurdjieff work? How did we do with Theosophy? And we see that increasingly the groups that came after Theosophy, with the exception of Anthroposophy, and the follow-on groups to Theosophy, Anthroposophy, and the Gurdjieff work and Casey's work seem to be a step down. Whether it's Alice Bailey's stuff or Elizabeth Clare Prophet, I'm sure they had their beneficial aspects. Krishnamurti's work after, they all come from a slightly less transformative place. It seems like if there's something that takes place there, just like, Gurdjieff had been trying to name a successor through, seems like, most of his teaching, and it just does not come around. And the people who come around and work around the ideas of Gurdjieff are fascinating, just like the people who worked after the fact on Steiner's idea, but they're not on the same level. You know, I mean, I've just, as someone who studied this stuff, I can tell you, it does not seem like there are any successors on any of those people that ever got up to the same level that they were operating at. Casey's work, there's a reason why Casey's so revered as the sleeping prophet, because, there are dramatically wonderful things that take place in all sorts of different ways. And there are great psychics and all the rest. But in terms of kind of mystery school information seeping into the culture and the work he did in Atlantis and stuff, there's no match. Steiner's work as a scholar, bringing in the spiritual realms, spiritual science that he was laying the foundation for, there has not been a public successor. I'm sure there's been some private activities of developing individuals to very high levels, but there does seem to be this incredible chemistry combination going on that takes us, say, from Blavatsky through the death of Gurdjieff and Casey and Steiner and Ouspensky. So that's basically a 75-year period. I guess if you went further back, you could find people like Allan Kardec and the incredible things that he brought forward, bringing reincarnation to the fore in the 1860s before anyone was really talking about it. So we have something remarkable in that line of work, but really from the announcement of the public mystery school theosophy, bringing this teaching forward to 1950, there's a 75-year growth period that just, so it reminds me very much, like if we're talking about music and people are like, well, the 60s were incredible musically, the 70s were remarkable, the 80s started to get off, and then, from the 90s on, we've had problems. It's interesting. I don't know what that is, but there's, I guess in artistic terms, you'd call it modern, postmodern, and things of this nature. So there is a postmodern aspect to this as well. But the promise in the heart of the mystery school teaching from Steiner is that the whole thing is going to come around again in this period. This is what I'm seeing in relation to the challenge that we're up against and this work that's vouchsafed for us that came through directly. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to be taking your questions, like I said, and also I want to remind you, go to darkjournalist.com if you're new here and sign up for that newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch, and that's really going to be something that we're going to need coming up in the future with all the massive censorship that we're watching. And we have some great things coming up for you this fall in terms of the X series and interviews, documentaries, just full boat. So now's the time to stand up and be counted. Make sure you're in there. Okay. Now, C.G. Harrison talks about the eighth sphere. Let's see what he has to say about it. Remember now, he's going back. We're talking the 1890s, okay? So it's still way before Steiner said anything about it. Steiner just starts talking about the eighth sphere much later. This is Harrison. My task this evening in this lecture is a difficult one. The truths which I shall endeavor to convey are fragments of knowledge pertaining to some of the very highest mysteries, the full comprehension of which requires the development of faculties wholly latent in the majority of human beings and but feebly developed in the West. It's unfortunate, isn't it? Even among initiates. Well, that's a problem. It will be my duty to explain to the best of my ability certain facts in connection with a mystery known as the mystery of the eighth sphere. It is sevenfold, and each of its minor mysteries is correlated to the sevenfold mystery of life on their seven planes of consciousness. He's taking us into that cosmology. Now, I'm well aware that there are many occultists who say that the subject ought not to be brought before the public at all, and object to the very name being mentioned. And some of them have been endeavoring to alarm my good friend, Mr. Blank, who has cautioned me to be careful whom I admit to these lectures of the Barian Society. In reply to such persons, it is due to myself to say I am breaking no oath and violating no confidence. These lectures were advertised in the public journals, and all who chose to attend them are welcome. I regret to be obliged to differ from many persons whom I hold in the highest respect. So even at this point, they're saying, don't talk about the eighth sphere, okay? As to whether or not the times are ripe for mentioning these subjects, I hold in the highest respect as to whether or not the times are ripe for mentioning these subjects. They have been mentioned prudently and imprudently and are familiar to all who have taken an interest in the theosophical movement. What is more, they are being thought about, and I am convinced with my own mind that under the circumstances, the continuation of the policy of total silence hitherto observed is less prudent than guarded speech. In other words, even if I don't let it all out, people need to be aware of this on some level, or else the scientific materialism coming in. The first person, however, to profane the mysteries unconsciously was Mr. Sinnett, the author of Esoteric Buddhism, a book which made considerable sensation when it came out, but which contains nothing new that is true and nothing true that is new. As he was the first to make public the information that there is an eighth sphere and a mystery connected with it, he is ignorant, it may well be, to say both of these statements are true. But when he proceeds to say that the eighth sphere is the moon, he gives utterance to one of the half-truths that are more misleading than falsehoods, as well give the definition of man, the aggregate of the chemical constituents of a decomposing body. The mystery of the eighth sphere is indeed the mystery of death. This is interesting, and it goes deeper, but what I want to do is snapshot this, because we have this piece coming out, and here are these mystery schools trying in some way to put the genie back in the bottle. But there's a reason some of the factors are kept under wraps, because the culture, it will misapprehend what's going on. And so it's better to share it in those circles. The fact that it got out and they had to do all of this jumping around trying to explain it gets very interesting, because they're trying to tell us something about the eighth sphere aspect, which is it's massively in development. But at that period in time, somehow, the awareness about the eighth sphere maybe could increase its potency. Maybe there were plans on how to short circuit it, or whatever it happens to be. It was not the right time to be talking about it. I happen to think that this is the era where the eighth sphere is supposed to be discussed, the one that we're in, and that the setup basically was supposed to be for 100 years. And that there's a weird lopsided thing that comes out of the mention of the eighth sphere getting out there. And it looks like the mystery schools did a lot of damage control for a long time, trying to make sure that this piece didn't get in the wrong hands, or if it did, they wouldn't know so much about it. But it tells me that we're in a period where understanding this becomes ever more crucial. And then when we take the next step and we look at what Steiner and others had to say about it, we start to understand that the idea of projecting our consciousness via the technology may have been the piece they didn't want to talk about, because to give a hint that this type of technology was happening might have, made that technology development go faster, or whatever it happens to be. And yet here we are directly in what they're describing there, is that harmonic influence of being herded into this virtual reality. And they're trying to do it through the very technology, which is such an incredible benefit for all of us. This is what we need to, I think, respond to and start to understand and research on a level with the eighth sphere that acknowledges this is the period. And that's why Steiner said, oh, in 100 years, you're back. This starts to open up the conversation, I think, in a way, as opposed to saying, well, there's a reference back here to this 19th century piece, and it has something to do with cosmology, but we don't know what it is. There's obviously a piece here, I think, which is dramatic. And that's what we're going to be getting into. What I want to look at now is Steiner's own resolution of the question as long as he was alive. I don't think the question got resolved by 1925 when he died, but there are some attempts at resolving it that are pretty interesting. everyone. You're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I'm going to try to get a couple of these pieces in. This is Steiner's own drawing of the influence of the eighth sphere, drawing the head of humanity. And I'm going to, I'll get into why I'm showing the head part. There's the eighth sphere drawing the influence. That is one of those Steiner blackboard images that are so fascinating, and the seals that get drawn. But it gives us that idea, again, that we are facing up against something that is magnetically drawing on us. And with a lot of those Steiner drawings, they are abstractions, and he was a great champion of abstract art. But I think that they do a kind of ponderance or meditation on some of those symbols does open up a vision beyond what he's just talking about in relation to. So I think we can get insights also from some of the work that he was doing around it artistically. Just like, a picture says 1,000 words. The picture of Ahriman is worth like how many lectures? I mean, that thing really gives us a hint. Okay, let's get, this is another, there's some very interesting exsteganography in Steiner's Portal of Initiation mystery series. And here is that one again. And I want to recommend it here. There's a piece that I have on this book called The Portal of Initiation, which is one of 4 mystery plays that Steiner does. But the dialogue that Ahriman has in it is worth checking out. And I think that these symbols in the exsteganography play a very interesting role in what he's trying to get across here. Someone I want to bring up in relation to this, because she discussed the eighth sphere as well, was Annie Besant, who took over for our friend Helena Blavatsky. And what happens is in Theosophy, they incorporate the exsteganography directly into the kind of topsy-turvy swastika that they have as their logo that then gets adopted later, reversed, and, Nazi groups run away with it. But when they were doing it, there weren't any Nazis. It had nothing to do with that. It was basically known as a good luck sun symbol. And the X ceremonies are about keeping that knowledge through the different eras. And you can find that Besant, working with Alcott after Blavatsky dies, tries to make sure that the Theosophical Society is successful. Something that Steiner points out, which I think is crucial, is that the mystery schools are very active and activated, involved in politics. So when we're looking at the politics now around the world, even the Trump raid, even the Biden fascist speech, even the clown Castro Trudeau, we're looking at people that have connections with the right-hand path and left-hand path schools. And the better that we figure that part out, the better we're going to understand what's going on. Besant definitely understood this. And she, before even there was a great movement to free India, was involved in the Free Ireland and Ireland Home Rule piece. She was also involved at a very young age in protests for young women working in conditions in chemical factories that were, where they go in and their hair would fall out, things of this nature. So this is somebody who had an incredible lust for justice throughout her life. And one of her greatest achievements is the work that she did with Gandhi and getting Gandhi. So Gandhi, member of the Theosophical Society, and Besant brings him forward and gives him all the tools he needs to get home rule for India. So, we have to remember this when it comes to Besant, Theosophy, Steiner. They're not contemplating things on a mountaintop so much. These are active people. They're engaged, they're involved, they're in voter drives, they're in strikes, they're in all the things that Gandhi did, all the protests, all the standing up to the British Army and the brutality and the peace movements and things. This is the core, the nature of the mystery school influence. And here it is in public with Besant, after having that incredible background and having the incredible training from Blavatsky and, working along this line, actually pushing through the incredible things that Gandhi would achieve. And that ripple effect, what happened with that ripple effect? It leads directly to Martin Luther King and the remarkable things that he did in this country, getting civil rights. And then you start to say, oh, now I understand the mystery schools. They've been moving the culture forward from behind the scenes for a while. And so we start to kind of get on board and understand this. We got the cosmology level, and now we understand it politically and how it relates to our day-to-day activities, as well as our spiritual intentions. And I've pointed this out also about Henry Wallace, who was the VP under FDR, a major theosophist who moved policy in Washington based on theosophical principles. And it's undeniable. Now we can look back and find it. At the time, he kept it pretty well hidden. And I want to say in that regard, I want to mention an interesting side note on all this. That's another really interesting shot of Besant. That there were people who were going to be really celebrated individuals in the Theosophical Society, and they also got into trouble for mentioning the eighth sphere, and they dropped off, and they became failed Chelas. And this is very interesting because they were
Chelas.
Yes, they were very highly developed, and they were very they were top students of Blavatsky before this came about. And I'm going to mention a couple of them tonight because they're not well known, but I think it's going to be kind of important just to remember, to get this eighth sphere history and understand exactly how the development of this came out and also the people that were involved. Before we go any further, though, I want to get these comments on about Besant talking about Blavatsky, who she revered and became the heir to. This is Besant now talking. In our own days, H.P. Blavatsky was largely used by her master and other teachers as such a means of communication. She was a most extraordinary and rare compound. Her body and nervous system were of the most sensitive type. She was born as a medium and was surrounded during her childhood and youth by a wealth of mediumistic phenomena. But she had also an intelligence of extraordinary vividness and a will of steel. Rarely indeed is such a combination found, but it's been ideal for an occultist. In fact, a master said no such body had been available for 200 years. Her character was positive and imperious, and her occult training made even stronger her already strong will. Throughout her life as one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, she was constantly stepping out of the physical body in order to place it at the service of her own master or one of the teachers, and be the face and voice sometimes to help them communicate their message. Colonel Olcott has told us in his book, Old Diary Leaves, that most of his own occult instruction reached him in this ancient way, that she would step out of her body, a master would step in, and through her lips would teach the eager, devoted disciple. Of all ways of communicating, as I said above, this is the best because it causes the least disturbance. But there are a few people who are fit to serve as such a channel, not understanding the conditions necessary to make the body fit for the use of a being on the level of an ascended master. People do not train and keep their bodies sufficiently well to be used in this way. And for the most part, what is done nowadays along these lines is not of the nature of possession, but rather of inspiration, when the mind is raised above its normal level by contact with the mind of the master, and some of his thoughts flow through it. I thought that interesting kind of bird's eye direct view of Blavatsky from Besant, her top student, kind of gives us that idea that Blavatsky is somebody who was kind of transcendent, and she could bring that other world here, and she was that channel. As an individual, she was very imperfect. She had a short temper, and she generally was problematic, I think, in terms of organizationally and otherwise. But this was somebody who was an incredible gift. And so we find her as this great breakthrough character. But what happens through that psychic imprisonment and through the monkeying around with her communications with these higher sources is that theosophy goes off the track, and it has too much of a Eastern character. And suddenly these Indian political forces who are in these left-hand path schools start to use her in these various ways. So we're lucky in this sense that we get theosophy into anthroposophy, because anthroposophy restores the Western initiators' role in all this, which is crucial because the Eastern initiators had set all this up for us for 3,000 years through the incredible works of Buddhism and others. But by the time you get to this period, it is the Western initiatory Rosicrucian tradition that is supposed to carry the ball and bring the culture forward. So it's very interesting that we got Steiner. But what is Steiner's central message? It's about Ahriman, and it's about the challenge of the eighth sphere. And that's what we find ourselves in the middle of. I've got more to add on this, and maybe this is 2 episodes, but we're going to take your questions now because Miss Olivia's got a lot.
You haven't brought up the Pope yet, have you?
Oh, no, I have that. I do have that, but we'll get to that.
Okay, I'm going to ask those questions now. Okay, so Violet Lotus says, explain how the current Pope relates to the ushering in of the eighth sphere. Brenda Fisher says, does DJ have thoughts about the Vatican calling for all Catholic institutions to deposit all assets in Vatican Bank by September 30th? And Willem Starchaser says, what is DJ's view on Putin and the Orthodox Church versus the globalists and the Vatican? It seems Putin is our only hope to defeat evil.
Well, I don't agree with that. And I think that Putin is very capable of, committing war crimes and other problems. So I have a big problem with that. I do feel that at the same time, there's a way to develop a relationship with Putin that would be great for the West and great for them. And that's something that president after president has worked on. If you look at the work that President Kennedy did under very tense circumstances, and even Reagan, Nixon, and these others, they were trying to forge that relationship. For this one Stepford idiot to throw it away and, really not have a plan for peace at all and just throw $100 billion at Ukraine and keep giving them all our military industrial complex weapons. It's the pits. I mean, we have the worst team out there negotiating, worse than any president ever. So we have a big problem in relation to that. But I think, if what we're looking at is a period in time where we have the ability now to use the deeper insight that's been brought forward by the mystery schools and apply it more publicly. So that, right now we have a bunch of people hiding behind, well, they belong to this group secretly and they belong to that group secretly. And we know there's a lot of occultists that are involved in Washington. So I think, people talk so much about disclosure and, oh, we need UFO disclosure and all this stuff from the government, which you're never going to get anything real from the government who lies to you about everything else on that subject. That's a very high level subject. Why are they going to tell you anything about it? They won't. But I will say this, that that greater understanding of the mystery schools, like having that be well understood by a broad cross-section will give us a much better impression. It's funny because if you look and you read Steiner in depth, he can't believe it. He's talking about all these conspiracies that are going on back then. And he's like, Franz Ferdinand, they set that off for World War I and all the rest. That was planned deep in those left-hand path secret societies. So understanding this piece, the occult piece, and the groups that operate within it, remember the esoteric sort of Rosicrucian piece, they are trying to move the society in a much better place. We also have to remember when it comes to the Pope that there are Catholic mystery schools involved with this. And I think it's very interesting, all the things that are going on in relation to the Vatican Bank. What's weird is I had not done an in-depth dive on the Pope recently, but I had a tremendous hunch there was something going on with the Vatican Bank. Isn't that weird?
That's interesting.
Don't ask me why, but, this is one of those things. Obviously, it's significant, but always thought Pope Francis being like the woke Pope and all that stuff is just a signal of the period that we're in. And of course, when you think about the Pope and all the rest of it, I found it hard to swallow that the Pope and the Dalai Lama were going along with the COVID threat. I mean, that was really interesting and eye-opening that even they had to be, kiss up to the whole thing. And so the Dalai Lama part really interests me because the whole role is as a renegade, and there he was promoting the COVID op. Quite fascinating.
His operation requires a lot of donations. This is all about money.
Yes.
So
a good deal of it is.
Yeah. It's all self-interest when it comes down.
And consolidation.
The Dalai Lama,
Absolutely.
Unfortunately. The Philip K. Dick Film Festival says Steiner warned against the coming vaccine. Would you like to address that?
Oh, well, he spoke of this on a few levels, and he spoke of it, and we do see those quotes. But you can go deeper than just those quotes that have come out about him talking about this. But he talked just about society in general and how there would come a point where they would develop an injection that would separate the soul from the body. And this, I think, is more of that him peering out into the 21st century. One of the things that he predicted about America was that America was going to create a rule that basically for no original thought, and that they were going to make a lot of this, and it was going to be an entire disgrace sometime in the 21st century. Boy, it sounds like we're really moving toward that right here and now. Outlawing thought, this is very 1984 principle. But I think that from a spiritual side of things, can you imagine looking at this situation clairvoyantly, where they were threatening people and their jobs over the COVID op, and we know that the incredible campaign that they ran against people who were resisting them on that front. Can you just imagine from a high spiritual level looking at that and seeing the degradation and the incredible injustice of the thing? So there's no question in my eyes that he was seeing this, envisioning it out over 100 years ago. Yes.
Down at the Heart says, did DJ say in a prior episode that Steiner mentioned there were 4 shades of the mystery schools, the light, gray more toward light, gray more towards the dark, and the dark?
Yeah, gray isn't actually a term that came up. And I think what's interesting, though, is that when he talked about dark left-hand path schools, he said there was dark and very dark. So, you can picture somewhere in there, very dark definitely operates from the more satanic level. Obviously, there's a level that works on a selfish, for selfish aims with selfish groups, but they're operating with the same knowledge that the other mystery schools have, who are trying to move the culture forward. So they both have access to the same thing. But
can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Do they know that they're dark or super dark? Some of them. I mean, do some of them work in ignorance or delusion?
Well, certainly. I mean, the people who are carrying out, like we were talking about in the American political system or something like that, and basically a global system of political control, those people that they roll out, a lot of them don't even know that they're being used as tools by these groups. So, yes, there's a range. There's certainly a wide range. But I would say that the dark secret societies are what Steiner was referring to directly. And then the left-hand path schools are also, trying to hoard humanity and are contributing to this harmonic 8th sphere condition. But there's an extreme. He referred to an extreme. So yeah, I couldn't say that he said gray anywhere, but he definitely talked about dark and very dark when it came to the left-hand path schools. And it's pretty interesting too, because that whole aspect, we have a great intro through the work of Crowley there's the whole Golden Dawn piece and all the rest of it. But it seems to me a lot of the ceremonial magic that those people use could also have been used for better causes. So even they don't seem like the apex to me of the type of thing he was talking about. It seems to me even a darker, a kind of far less ethical branch than that. Yes.
I see butts. Does the Ahriman spiritual invasion take place primarily in the political spheres, or does it manifest in our individual spirits also? And Christine Laurel says, with the jabs turning humans into human 2.0, a human AI hybrid, humanity itself could be the incarnation of Ahriman.
That's true. Or they could be looking for someone who can carry Ahriman. And it might be a long scale.
So you don't think it's us all
No,
together?
as a whole, no.
Okay.
No, I mean, of course, Ahriman.
Sort of like the Internet of Bodies.
Well, no, it's two, though. It is twofold. So it's Ahriman's influence, one, just like the Christian influence. There's the Christ incarnation, which is singular, and then its impact on everyone. And then there's the Ahrimanic incarnation, actual physical incarnation, and then its effect on everyone. So I think what's fascinating about Ahriman, let's think of this for a moment and some of the things that Steiner was talking about. He's saying that there's a being that's been trying to trick humanity into this eighth sphere for generations and generations since the world began. And that this being got wrapped up in our own evolution, and we're sort of stuck with it and need to face off against it in order to develop ourselves. And the cosmology that Steiner takes us into is about developing what he calls the warmth to fulfill the sphere of Vulcan. And then Vulcan becomes the foundation of New Jupiter. And New Jupiter is basically what they promised in the Bible is New Jerusalem, and he takes that and those steps for us going into New Jupiter. So there's a lot where he's speaking cosmologically, but he's addressing the mystery schools directly through the Steiner work are addressing what happens. Where does this evolutionary wing go? And so what Steiner's saying is there's a being, a force, a dark astral force, which is interrupting the flow of humanity from achieving its natural spiritual evolution. It is moving to block humanity and harvest humanity into what? Into the eighth sphere, where it's an artificial step in evolution. So yes, esoteric Christianity through anthroposophy, through the Casey readings, through theosophy, opens up the idea of reincarnation. And what the idea is that you go through the different planets and learn in this system in different bodies in those planets. So, it's a Venus body, it's a Jupiter body, whatever it happens to be, not physical like we are, but a counterpart. And you're supposed to come back here and fulfill that. And then you go out of the system having developed within it. So apparently what the Ahriman eighth sphere is an artificial step. And the way that they do that is those beings who get dominated by Ahriman would go then into the eighth sphere instead of the natural chain of evolution. And then they would reincarnate quickly here and become more and more caught up in matter. So on the surface, it's scientific materialism. We all know people who think just scientifically and won't talk about anything spiritual. I've dealt with them my whole life, and they've probably always thought that I was crazy for talking about it. But it doesn't matter because they've shut off that aspect, and that's just their own choice. I'm not going to proselytize them to do it. However, you can see how insidious that influence is when it comes to things like developing nuclear weapons or nanotechnology, or the ability to use, video game controls in order to bomb people in other countries. So once you shut off your ethical center, your connection to spiritual, your own spiritual life, and then you really find yourself half a being. And then that's a eighth sphere contestant. That's an eighth sphere citizen. That's an Ahrimanic takeover. And then those people, we've seen them also, they lose more and more of their humanity in public. Look at Joe Biden the other night. That's a perfect case of just an empty vessel being filled up with an Ahrimanic force. And that's, he's operating right in the eighth sphere. But I think that type of display by the left-hand schools through that imagery that Biden was doing tells us that the the left path is sort of gearing up for a massive move of some sort. And, I heard the echoes in my head of Steiner and World War One. And, so there's something to that. So the timing on this Eighth Sphere episode is no accident. Yes.
Lucy Rain says, it seems like they flipped a switch and we entered bizarro world, like we're in a different dimension. Our elected representatives really do seem possessed by, quote, demons.
Well, they're all taking on. It's interesting. I'm going to do my own sort of analysis here of body language. But look at the body language of somebody like Chrystia Freeland. They know that they have to say, I get the same body language from Biden's press agent. Can't remember her name, but she's the new one, the young one that took over for Psaki. And she seems as dumb as a box of rocks, unfortunately. But
she's pretty though.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. But what's interesting is, she has a quality to her where she has to say ridiculous things. So they're like, even the liberal press is like, well, wait a minute, are you saying that like the Trump people are dangerous? That's half the country. Like, well, what's that all about? And, are you saying that their voters are dangerous? Are you declaring war on half the country? What's this about? And, by the way, the press asked, why are you using Marines when that's a political speech? You're not supposed to do that. And all she could say was, she adopted this thing where she sort of put her head down when she's talking. And this is the same thing with Freeland. They have to put their heads into a position in order to repeat something that's absolutely ridiculous and doesn't answer the question. But your head still has to be kind of in the game, I guess.
Well, it's like a child who can't look at you in the eye when they're lying to you. Right?
Exactly right. And I'm seeing this a lot with these leaders who are doing that. They know that what they're saying is ridiculous, but they also know the penalty if they don't say it. And this is what I get to with the people who control the social media companies. When they go back to the Davos crowd, if they were like to come back in 2020 and say, Trump got reelected, there was nothing we could do about it. Obviously, that punishment was going to be a lot worse from the Davos crowd than owning up to the fact that they, blocked the New York Post, that they stopped free speech, that, Zuckerberg through the FBI tried to swing the election to Biden, all that stuff, even though they're going to be sort of taken down and seen in public for what they really are, they don't care because whatever the other punishment's worse and whatever it is. Yes.
Cosmic Ocean, Atlantean science is here again in the Eighth Sphere. CRISPR, genetic eugenics, AI, the Atlanteans have reincarnated trying to fulfill their failed projects.
Oh, well, that's true. That's true. And I'm going to do another Atlantis show coming up, which gets really to that. And I want to have...
What would you say is the link between what's happening now with the push towards the Eighth Sphere? All of this is playing into that. How come we didn't go into the Eighth Sphere back in Atlantis? Wouldn't that have been
these things I believe are developmental. So I would say that just like, the outline of the Eighth Sphere was certainly developed in that period, but it was a phase of evolution, and the harmonic powers were deep involved and caused the destruction in that period. And what's interesting is there's something quite fascinating in the Steiner work relating to Ahriman about Atlantis, which goes something like this, which is after the destruction of Atlantis, the target of the Ahrimanic powers from there, because they had really contributed greatly to that destruction, was North America. They wanted to take over North America and Mexico. And this is quite interesting because there are a number of efforts to prevent them from doing that. But they were engaged in this fooling process. And we hear about this over and over again. And I'm going to get into it deeper in a different episode. But part of it has to do with creating the Ahrimanic forces, creating an etheric double of the individuals and working with their double, influencing them. So this subject goes deep. I'm going to get a real good example here. So he talks about this figure that was major in Atlantis, this kind of holy figure that is basically the root of the term Om. So we'll just call it OHM. And this is kind of an echo, a memory of this Emilius force that was guiding these Atlanteans towards a higher spiritual incarnation physically. And Om when we get to America after the fact of the destruction of Atlantis, the Ahrimanic power assumes the guise, shapeshifts into this Om entity and appears to the different priests and things like that among the Maya and all the rest, imitating this thing that helped the Atlanteans. So there's an imitative quality to the Ahrimanic force. There's a mask to it. And so the cosmology runs deep when you start to look, in the Steiner work about Ahriman's influence and how it kind of arrives at this point. It's been active for a long time. Apparently, it was active at a point where humanity was completely defenseless. And when, in the period of cosmology, when the solar beings had gone off to the sun in America, and not America, but the Earth itself was sort of left adrift and these darker influences got in. So this is an old story, whatever's going on. And, so many of the stories, I think there's a hint in Ouspensky's Tales of the Devil, which have some of this too. But there's that hint in there that something took place, which is part of the unconsciousness and the forgetfulness of our civilization now. Yes.
Lucy Rain says, Steiner said, quote, "This Ahrimanic incarnation cannot be averted. It is inevitable, for men must confront Ahriman face to face." Did Steiner believe that the incarnation of Ahriman in whatever manifestation was necessary if humanity's consciousness is to develop? Or is this a trajectory sparked by us inadvertently, disastrously? Along those lines, Karen Carpenter, who asked the best question, says, would the facing of the eighth sphere battle be considered humanity's dark night of the soul? Did Steiner say if we would get another shot at beating Ahriman if we didn't do it this time?
Well, he talks about the extreme danger of the ascendancy of Ahriman. But to answer the early part of that question, Ahriman has to be faced off against, and it's inevitable. That's the way that Steiner described it. He says the only way it would be a disaster for humanity is if humanity comes upon it in a sleepy, overstimulated state. So if we're in that virtual reality realm, if you're, over excited by the technology, if your brain's been turned into mush by, the various apps and things, once they start to insert that stuff into your system, forget it, right? So the technology is going to help our conscious mind fall to sleep, and then we'll wake up and this thing will be taking over. So we see, what's weird is we see so many aspects of it now, and it sounds almost like a science fiction story when you read it back there and you're looking at Steiner's work and you're saying, what is it he's trying to get at about Ahriman? Remember, Steiner's no slouch. He spent all the time of development in the mystery schools. He spent all the time developing anthroposophy. He spent all the time with the top people in theosophy. Why is he emphasizing Ahriman? Why is he emphasizing the eighth sphere? Why is he pointing to this period in time? Now, these are the questions we need to answer. What did he leave that indicates to us why he brought these things up? And I think he has left some of the things we've touched on tonight, but some of it, I think, is something where the general message is that Ahriman is a stage, a development, which what's interesting is he describes it as facing off against Ahriman for Christ. Now, that goes into a different conversation too. But what's interesting about that is humanity has to acquire something from Ahriman for us to go forward in our own spiritual evolution. That's the cosmology as told by Steiner.
Oh, isn't it? Actually, I mean, I just sort of, the penny dropped. It's obvious that no matter how you see Ahriman, it's a test. So
yes,
that's it. It's very simple. And it's really easy to push out God, right? To edge out God and make technology your God. And
we're seeing it.
Yes,
we're
exactly.
Seeing it.
And you say,
yeah.
and it takes you down a path that separates you from God even more than you're already separated. Really, it's sort of, once you go down a path, it's a slippery slope and you go down, right?
That's
and
right.
It probably takes a really long time in that soul evolution, because it's devolution, right? To come back, rise back up.
Yes.
So that's what this is all about, is that we actually have a real choice of forgetting God and really losing our connection. And
although some of it,
choosing God now, right? And that is, we're having a real bifurcation of humanity right now.
Yes. No, I think that that's true. But see, we can even have, this is the funny thing about thinking about this, because you can have very harmonic thought traits in thinking about spiritual things. So you might think, oh, I'm thinking about spiritual things, so therefore I'm not in that harmonic thing. However, there's a repetitive machine-like quality to those types of thoughts. And so that's harmonic in itself. So it is kind of interesting, because some of the choice that could be going on here, remember Steiner's talking about us being caught unawares by it. So some of the choice is about being conscious, and then from that conscious point of view, being able to see these types of influences. The more unconscious we are, the more those things get in. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show, very deep tonight on the eighth sphere and the crisis involved with the harmonic spiritual takeover. These are the things that we're facing off against, and we're taking your questions now. I'm going to read a quote here briefly from Steiner on this very exact subject, and then we're going to switch back to your questions. And remember, I want to remind you, if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter for you, and it allows us to communicate without fear of that deep censorship that we see going on. We've been trying to bring out some of that mystery of the Steiner images and the different things going on. And this one, of course, the erroneous fear of the spiritual. This is that harmonic force coming in, the eighth sphere impact. And one of the things that Steiner talks about in relation to Ahriman is very interesting, that it targets the head. And when you talk esoterically about the head, it's particularly interesting. But the idea that they could take your head, and in the evolutionary process, they basically, that's the thing that they're after. They're after your attention, and they're after that function of your thought. So that's where the control level is in the harmonic eighth sphere piece. It's all about your thinking. And so that's something to keep in mind, them drawing your thoughts away and drawing your thoughts into different things. So that's how they operate, apparently. And a little bit more on this. I have two quotes I want to read. This one I think is important. And it says, it's speaking about how we faced off against this before. Because egotism is the fundamental power in the soul, the war of all against all will rage within the larger part of humanity. This is his prediction going forward. The war of all against all will rage within the larger part of humanity. As the Lemurian race found its end through the power of fire, and the Atlantean through water, so will the fifth race, that's this one, fifth root race, find its destruction in conflict between selfish, egotistic powers in the war of all against all. The egotistic line of evolution will descend deeper and deeper. When it reaches the bottom, everyone will rage against everyone else. Sound familiar? A small part of humankind will escape this, just as a small part escaped during the destruction of the Atlantean race. It's up to every individual to find a connection to spiritual life in order to be the one of those to go over into the sixth root race. That's the next coming race. Mighty revolutions stand before humankind. These revolutions are described in the Apocalypse. By understanding such a work, we allow ourselves to be stimulated by the spirit who spoke through Helena Blavatsky. What the Theosophical Society seeks to achieve must strike us like a trumpet proclamation sent to humankind. The more we understand the Apocalypse, the more we understand the task of our movement of anthroposophy. So he sees it as this is what we're facing up against. Now, I want to point this out too, that Theosophy generally sees a kind of a rosy future. The sixth root race comes in and they have psychic abilities. They understand reincarnation. You know, they're much deeper. And we see evidence that our consciousness around psychic matters is increasing. And some people have written to me saying, you know, I think my kid's really psychic. And I see that this is a major trend. I believe that. So that's the rosy scenario of Theosophy, which says the world teacher, we move into the sixth root race, we start to understand things, we come from a better place. Steiner's a little bit different. Steiner basically says, yes, you know, we go through this cosmic evolution. We have the ability to create new Jupiter. We have the ability to move and spiritually evolve on Earth. But there's this harmonic clash through the technology that happens in this era of the 21st century, and the war of all against all takes place. It doesn't specify when, but there's a hint in Steiner's work that actually the war is so deep of all against all that the right side of the human body starts to war with the left side of the human body. So we can see they've been trying to face us off against more and more war, and they've been doing this. They're experts at it for a long time. But now with the technology, they're setting people off, and there's a lot of brainwashing involved in this kind of propaganda for, you know, there's so many different things every day when you open it up. You know, you might be looking on social media, you might be looking on a website, and they're just pitting you constantly against somebody else. It doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, like you're being pitted against somebody else. So we get hints of that war of all against all. So if it comes down to the fact that it's an Ahrimanic force, which isn't human, by the way, and what it's trying to do is have the human right side war with the human left side, think about that. That's the aim. Because if humanity is defenseless fighting itself, the Ahrimanic powers create the eighth sphere. That's the message of the story in anthroposophy. Steiner was very aware of the mystery schools, the mystery tradition, and the mystery knowledge. Why is Steiner giving us that story? There's a reason, and we're living it. This is the thing. Yes,
we're definitely living it. Third eye is
making it in Massachusetts too.
Third eye is Ahriman the beast. Is he manifesting as mankind's greatest threat?
Yes, Ahriman's the beast in Revelation, definitely. So there's a piece there where all the mystery schools talked about 1998 setting the stage for all these things. It doesn't mean that 1998 was supposed to be a year that the world blew up, but we can see the trend starting off from 98 seems to be 9/11, the financial crash, the COVID op, you know, the terrible emergency powers, power grab, the incredibly awful Stepford Biden regime. So, you know, this is the nature of what's been happening. 1998 is 666 times 3. And there's a numerology to that date. Casey identified 1998 as the testing period going forward. So it's from 98 on. And we find ourselves in the middle of all this. There have been other dates that have been mentioned along the way. As I mentioned, Steiner referred to this period of 2020. Gene Dixon made a prediction about 2020. You know, I learned that through Robert Merritt, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of things that are on the record about this period of time. And I think what we're looking for is, you know, not to live through predictions and things, but to understand the trend from something that's been demanding so much of us. What is it that's happening? You know, now they're trying to move in on the whole, oh, there's drought. Oh, there's food shortages. Oh, you're not going to be able to use your car. They're moving into a phase, and even that World Economic Forum thing where they said, hey, don't worry, the robots are going to do all the work. Well, if I'm not productive, then on your charts, I'm not valuable. Therefore, you're going to get rid of me in general. So, that whole thing needs to be understood. If humanity is just up there thinking everything is going to go along the way it used to, we're going to have a real problem. There's going to be a real heavy wake-up call there. And I think that people, this is one thing that's terrific about Gigi Young's work, and Catherine Fitz has also had a piece of this, which is it looks very much like society going in two different directions. And Steiner is saying there's going to be a certain period there when a small group survives this war of all against all. And this is kind of the hint of it, right? It's the preservation group. It is the Essenes with the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They're not the majority. When Christ incarnates, he doesn't have the largest majority. The Pharisees and the Romans are in control. So what does he do? He's operating with a small mystery school of Essenes. It's this is the way that things develop. It is the small sort of influence that builds the whole thing. It is that intense flame that lights up the whole nation. So yes, I mean, I think there'll be moves to make the general public, through the mystery schools, they're going to be moves to improve the culture. But this culture might very well implode on itself. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm going to read you one other quote here, and then we'll take a couple more of your questions, and then we're out. How does that sound?
Doing great.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the Eighth Sphere Crisis. Steiner predicted it, the Armonic spiritual invasion. What is it? Why is he pointing it out to us? What is the real legacy of the Steiner work besides the incredible spiritual knowledge he left? Maybe we can find out here. Okay, I thought this was interesting. Blavatsky had been connected with American spiritualists who wanted to let the teaching of reincarnation disappear. Now, the reincarnation teaching came out through Kardec, like I said, in the 1860s, and Theosophy brought it out. But there was a group that wanted to put the genie back in the bottle, and Harrison, from that part of his Transcendental Universe book, he's talking about how reincarnation, that's not the right doctrine or whatever. So they're trying to get rid of this piece. And the idea that Steiner says that the reason that they're doing that is because they don't want to upset the spiritual outlook for Christian Europe and Christian America, because they're worried about that piece and leaving that piece in there. So there's a war that's in public by the mystery schools over including the reincarnation piece or leaving the reincarnation piece out. I almost said the UFO piece. Yes, all things were on the table. Blavatsky had been connected with American spiritualists who wanted to let the teaching of reincarnation disappear. Mediumship was a means to that end, and the method was adopted. As Blavatsky revolted, she was expelled and came more and more under the sway of the Indian occultists. She was driven into their hands. This led to a conflict between American and Indian views on the sphere of occultism. On one side, there was a strong tendency to let the teaching of reincarnation vanish from the scene, and on the other side, the urge to bring this teaching into the world, but in a form that took advantage of the materialistic leanings of the 19th century. This was a possibility if the teaching about the eighth sphere was presented by Sennett in Esoteric Buddhism. There are a number of other facts of perhaps sufficient importance to be at least indicated. I don't want to shock you by what I am saying, but I do want to explain the spiritual principles that your own standpoint should be based upon. Two difficulties had arisen as a result of the way in which the teachings about the eighth sphere had been presented in Sennett's book. Blavatsky had created one of the difficulties herself. She knew that what Sennett had written on the subject was false, but she also knew that she was in the hands of those who desired the false teaching should be inculcated into humanity. Therefore, she tried in a certain way, as you can read in The Secret Doctrine, to correct this conception of the eighth sphere and matters relevant to it. Do you see how much of a battle there is over this concept? And I think Steiner gives it away. He talks about it in relation to reincarnation. So this idea of the false reincarnation into the eighth sphere with a quick return to Earth under the control of this harmonic mechanism, this seems to be what they didn't want to reveal about the eighth sphere, and what they were apparently, this is what all the trouble is about. Blavatsky is saying to these groups, no, you can't leave reincarnation out. I'm going to include it. And they're saying, no, you can do all this mediumship stuff and you can do all this, the rest of this, but you can't include the reincarnation piece. That's the big why. The next why is Steiner including that section right next to the problem of the eighth sphere? It doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. To me, Steiner is giving us the indication something about that eighth sphere involves reincarnation. And that's where I think we need, we understand it as a virtual reality realm. We understand it sucks, the life basically out of the individual that gets drawn in. So now we need to look at the eighth sphere piece and say, what does it have to do with reincarnation? What is he getting at? And I think it has to do with this upsetting the natural path of the soul's evolution. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I just wanted to say, everybody, do you understand? Are you starting to understand how important this incarnation is at this time? How important the ideas room is? I'm feeling this very much. I'm very grateful.
Oh, yes.
That, all of us were raised to have certain expectations for this lifetime, certain things that we wanted, we envisioned for ourselves. But what is being asked of us is so much greater, and it has so much more meaning. And that's what we're all processing here. And
interesting.
Anyway,
yes,
Laurent Rawlings.
Do you see how damn important this is? I like the way you put it.
Facing Ahriman for Christ, you said. Please elaborate.
Yeah, it is apparently in that battle that, Steiner basically boils it down to three forces impacting our spiritual evolution: Lucifer, Ahriman, and Christ. And humanity facing off against Ahriman acquires through that battle something from Ahriman that's necessary for this spiritual evolution piece to go. So there's a great value in it. I guess you could say it is the character building. We understand challenges in our own life. There's many versions of this going on all the time. And this is what's so fascinating, because I was thinking about, and I'm going to talk with Gigi Young about this when we have her on next. She's been referring to some things along this line. I've been thinking a lot lately about the idea in the mystery schools of seals, and how an idea is sealed, or the seals of revelation, and how in the deeper spiritual tradition, it's a seal. And I think that what is coming across in my interpretation around anthroposophy and what might be vouchsafed in there is, just as he was using the seals for his mystery plays, including the steganography, I think individuals through the new mysteries will need to be sealed against the Ahrimanic influence, and that there's a method in this work. Just like, I go back to a conversation that he had with Helmut Klimt saying, your paintings are too advanced, you can't let them out for 75 years. He knows there's something in the work that's going to be valuable later. So I find myself wondering if the sealing of individuals against the Ahrimanic influence, and this is all, through their own individual understanding, their own individual study, whatever it happens to be. But it seems like this is really the process that he's discussing, because there's a kind of insulation against the Ahrimanic forces, so that you don't just take them on, but you're sealed against their influence getting in, and then you fight with them and acquire through that battle. And remember, that's part of that's cosmological. I'm not saying that people should go out and fight against Ahriman. I think that it takes place, if there is the war of all against all, the things that he's talking about, it takes place from a spiritual place first. That's for sure. And of course, it manifests in a number of different ways. But this thing is, there's a process, there's an esoteric process that's referenced. And I think the sealing and being sealed against these influences is what he's getting at. So this is my interpretation of where he's coming from. I think that there's enough echoes in there that we're finally starting to get through Steiner that foundation. And this is what I think the mystery schools are about. They are setting us up for this period. And that's why they decided, you know what, we're going to let everything out in 1875.
So are you, with SEALs, are you talking about initiations and completing initiations? And therefore that's, like a lesson is learned, it's done. You've achieved, you've got the patch, it's done.
Yes.
And so you never need to revisit that lesson again. Is that what these SEALs are representing?
Yeah. I think that you develop a kind of initiation through your life struggle. I think that the idea that an influence could come in from the outside and take possession of you, which is what the technology is attempting to do, that, can you imagine, all of these, think about younger people falling prey to the technology. We understand the technology because we've lived with it, we've seen it develop, and we've seen people before and after and all the rest. People who grow up in that system are truly subject to it. Unfortunately, it could be the greatest thing in the world, but unfortunately, what they're using it for, we can already see them involved in a number of nefarious activities. But if you had the entire groups of people sealed against that influence, then you'd be on a level playing field with it, because that would be the thing that people would be doing to seal themselves against that influence from entering. That is what I think anthroposophy is for, ultimately. That's what I think the emphasis around the eighth sphere and Ahriman is for. Yes.
I wanted to ask this. I don't know where you're going to take it, but Shamanist Anamkara says, when Christ left his body, instead of ascending, he brought his spirit down into the actual earth.
Yeah, well, he in Steiner's work, he went into the realm of the dead and changed the way that whole realm operates during those 3 days of resurrection. So that's pretty interesting, because before that, there were different mysteries for how that period operated with us. So the Osirian mysteries from the Egyptian times were what Christ and John the Baptist used when they spent the night in the Great Pyramid. That's in the mystery tradition. It comes out of the Casey work. They had done this. They spent the 3 days. Christ spent the 3 days in the king's chamber in the sarcophagus, and then came back to life as part of a ritual of the Essenes before he actually did the real thing. And this is the old Osirian thing. This is how they used to train the initiates in that period. Once Christ had triumphed over the physical body, he went into the realms of death and overcame that realm. So Ahriman no longer had the powerful influence there. So all the initiatory rites changed after the mystery of Golgotha. That's the Steiner story of how this worked, with the Casey part mixed in. But it makes, it lets you realize the drama of that period and the echo some 2,000 years later. Yes.
Conrad Black, what are the spheres 1 through 7?
They are, the whole list of them is basically the evolutionary track that humanity was on, and that goes through the moon, Earth, sun, and several of the planets. So the eighth sphere and the way it's set up is it's an artificial aberration around Earth. And it's interesting because I had some images when I was working on the space fence, and I did a piece on the space fence, and I was shocked in looking at it. I was like, it's funny talking about the space fence because, damn, it really, this thing from our friends at Lockheed Martin, that really looks a heck of a lot like the eighth sphere. And I think this is a way for us to interpret it, which is it's a sphere in development. And as we understand spheres, physically, there's an aspect of us seeing planets and all the rest of it. But apparently, there are spheres that have operational influence, which aren't, we can't, from a physical standpoint, apprehend. It requires what? According to Steiner, it requires atavistic clairvoyance. It requires that ability to penetrate the mystery, not using your physical senses. So we're talking about using faculties that are latent in 99% of the population, although they come out, when they come out in certain situations, it's very shocking to see just how highly developed they are in some people. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Couple more questions with you tonight on the eighth sphere crisis. Great questions coming out of the ideas room and great people joining us tonight. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here. Saturday night. And of course, last night we did the Joseph Farrell interview, The Secret Money, which had a great response.
It was rollicking.
It was pretty rollicking. And I want to remind you that we'll be back next Friday with a new X Series episode as well. There might be some special reports between now and then. We'll take a couple more questions and we are out. By the way, I see Chrissy out there. Happy birthday, Chrissy.
Oh, it's Najat's birthday also.
Hey, Najat, happy birthday. We have 2 birthdays there in the ideas room. If there's more, let us know. But I hope it's a great day to have as a birthday. And that, I believe, makes them Virgos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Virgo. Whoa.
Detail-oriented. Possibly perfectionistic.
Yes. Okay. I'm ready.
Okay, Zach Robinson. Thinking on the eighth sphere, the eighth note in a typical Western music scale is an octave. Same note as the first note in the scale. An octave is like an Ouroboros, a circle from the seventh note to the eighth note. The cycle repeats. Thoughts?
That's very interesting. If you go into Gurdjieff, it's In Search of the Miraculous, is the book that has the octaves and how Gurdjieff basically thought that in the Western musical scale, they had preserved the ancient mystery knowledge and that the key was in the octaves and that the key was in the half steps, because in that incredible setup, you have those very unusual moves there and there's no flats or sharps in those. I guess it's, is it E and F and B and C? I think that's what it is. And that's very interesting. If you look at that system, that he's saying that in the Pythagoras time, they had moved that into the Western musical scale for a reason, to let us understand how that scientific method develops. And it's sitting there right in the musical scale. So I think that you're really onto something. If you look at the Gurdjieff musical scale information, since you're very musically minded, let me know if you find anything based on your question. Just send me an email at admin@darkjournalist.com and I'll check it out. Yes.
Michael Gale Media. Is 9/11 being used as a tool of ascension? Sounds like a traumatic situation allows for an opportunity to ascend. Did I understand, DJ?
No, I don't think that. No, I think 9/11 is a cult right and on its basis, and then it has a number of implications politically, which relate to the control that these groups like to have over nations. So it was a big excuse to unleash the biggest war machine in the world. It was a big excuse to take different rights away from you and I. So that's how it was used. One of the things that Steiner was referring to was, he was saying that back in that period where he was, let's say World War I period, 1916, that he's saying, look, the Franz Ferdinand piece, this is set up in these secret societies long time in advance, and that the public has no idea what's going on. And he's talking about conspiracies. I think Steiner would really get a kick out of the fact that we're able to talk this openly in the ideas room about it in this era. And he probably would frown on all the misinformation and junk conspiracy that's been thrown into the field. But he definitely would see the value of us expanding our consciousness. If you look back and really talk about those early anthroposophical meetings, there's a description of them meeting in a bar, and the bar is like under some weird construction. So they have to go all the way around this big hole that goes down about 20 feet to meet on the other end of it. So they can hear a lecture by Steiner, in these weird pubs in Germany. And he's talking about 20 or 30 people showing up for that and the difficulties that they encountered. And I think about the Russian Revolution piece with the Gurdjieff groups and how they met under very difficult circumstances. So in fact, even with all the difficulties, we're extremely lucky to have this opportunity. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak with you directly here, even if it's through these various social networks or whatever, because we get that opportunity in this time, this day, to go over these very important things and to enlighten each other about them. That's what the Ideas Room is all about. Yes.
Shamanist Autumn Kara says, DJ Steiner is probably protecting you in the Ideas Room from the spiritual realms.
Well, he talks all about how Blavatsky is, moving the story from the spiritual realm, and that she's, from her spiritual place after death. He's like, he talks to students and he's like, don't just cling to the memory of Blavatsky. She's so active now in the spiritual world. She's having a tremendous impact. So that's good to know, because she did so much for humanity. She's a very unusual individual. If you study her, she's under tremendous disadvantage as a woman and as a foreigner here. And she's psychic, so she's kind of an outcast. But she achieves this incredible thing for humanity. And she also creates this Theosophical Society, which, there's nothing really in that period. I mean, you have movements like New Thought and Christian Science and things like that, but Theosophy is really quite unusual.
Excuse me if I missed this, but have you ever covered why Blavatsky was so gifted in this incarnation? What her past incarnations were all about, that she had earned this upgrade?
Well, it's very interesting because although in Theosophy they do reveal at the end of their lives who the people were, which is how we found out that Besant was Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake for saying, oh no, actually it's was the earth around the sun or the sun around the earth? But what's interesting,
the earth orbited the sun.
Yes. So there's a very famous artist from Theosophy named A.E., and he had a vision of Blavatsky on the astral plane. And he saw her as this Atlantean warrior. And I've shown that picture before. It is powerful. But this is an incredible spirit who came through, this woman. And we have a lot to learn about what Blavatsky, what happened there, and what she did, and the incredible things that she achieved. But what was the thrust of your question again?
I just wonder
if she's going to reincarnate again?
No. What her past
who she was
lives
before,
were,
yes.
So that she came in with so much power and so much influence.
All I can tell you about this, which is interesting, is that Steiner makes some comments that the mystery schools were aware that an individual had been born who was going to have a great impact. So they knew they tracked her astrologically before she came in. This is pretty interesting. And I have to tell you, I've noticed whenever I've studied on the mystery school tracks, all of the individuals have something funky about their name or something funky about their date of birth. In Gurdjieff's case, he has two different date of births. And there's a thing about his name too, with G.I. Gurdjieff, and then sometimes George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, and then sometimes the Gurdjieff is spelled differently. I find that interesting, and I've seen it with a number of them. So I've come to the conclusion that a lot of these esoteric masters don't want someone to have, one, their exact date of birth, two, their exact name, because that person then will be in a position to draw, one, a chart based on the name, or two, a chart based on their date of birth, and understand different types of things about them. So I've seen that for a long time, and I've wondered about it. That's my explanation. I could be wrong, but that's what I think it is. Yes.
So this is tempting to go for. I'm going to go for it. Okay. So Get Out of the John Boy says, Arman Mambo Jumbo, we all have free will and the ability to use it. It's incredibly simplistic thinking, and I wanted you to address it, especially the idea that we actually have free will, because we've had many conversations about the fact that we don't really have free will.
Well, I think the Gurdjieff work, when you do it, exposes just how much free will you've got. So,
or that you don't have, because you have no discipline.
That's right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I understand, fundamentally, just like with astrology, the Casey readings made a great point about this. They said, look, your will supersedes any influence. So in that sense, you're right. However, you're going to have to know what you're up against, regardless of how well developed your will is. So that's where I think the mystery schools coming forward and sharing that with the public is so valuable. And not everybody has such a strong will. So I think that a lot of this teaching, and the teaching of the fourth way, and the Casey work, Casey's work is thoughts are things. How do we operate with that? How are we doing with controlling our thoughts if they are actually things? Well, some people are pretty good at it, but it's not easy. It's not easy to even shut off our minds long enough to stop thinking. So there's a great deal to be developed there. Let's put it that way. That would be my answer.
Yeah. Actually, Metamorphosis says a strong free will is actually spiritually powerful against dark entities. I'll just share for a minute that I'll go for it, demonically possessed for a period of my life, and that I experienced as depression, and but in a suicidal ideation. And it took, I was in therapy, but until I actually shifted through meeting some people who pulled these entities out of me, I did not have much relief, and that was incredible. So we are very porous beings, and the way that external influence can influence us is through thoughts, which we take on to think are our own. And so, yes. What is free will? Because there was a will that was impacting me, that was telling me to do something which was not mine, but it was using my own inner voice to tell me to do so. You could misinterpret. This is where discernment comes in. What is me? What is not me?
Well, that's very interesting. There's a lot of different things with what you just said. Mm-hmm. I think what it is it's that whole thing about the angel on the shoulder and the devil on the shoulder, right? Every human has that ability to be tempted, right? In the Christian story, the devil has 40 days to tempt Christ in the desert, and Christ has to go through those various temptations, including being offered all the world's kingdoms if he just follows Satan. But in terms of the other thing that you're talking about there's a series of Casey readings about possession. And a lot of them have to do with alcoholism, interestingly enough. But he also talks about gold being a factor in driving out influences like that. And at one point, he suggests somebody lies down on the beach, on Virginia Beach, which is apparently gold rich. And then there's also gold solutions and things like that. That is very interesting. I've seen people possessed with ideas, with depression and various things. And there's a Steiner explanation where he was talking with a priest who didn't realize that he was an anthroposophist. And the priest became incredibly righteous with him and started to demand, that he leave, this event and all that. And he was not a holy person and all this. And behind him, astrally, Steiner saw this like 14th century priest who had basically participated in the kind of witch burning type things. And he was influencing this priest. And so there are these influences around us at all times. And I think, so some of the things that you're talking about there in relation to whether it's depression or other things, that there are entities that prey on our weaknesses. And I have to say that when you look at the Steiner work, I think what he's talking about there is something that takes that to a level that is global, right? It's the entire swath of humanity. Ahriman being the tempter, Ahriman being the kind of evil influence on humanity. So you have the macrocosm version, the big version of this Ahrimanic thing, and then you have the individual struggle of the individual and the influences that it faces. But that's remarkable. I mean, I really think that's a remarkable way to look at it. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to take the last question.
Okay, well, I want to end on a positive note, so I'm just going to read these. Philip K. Dick Film Festival, Steiner emphasizes humility and love as a prerequisite for his trainings. And Luke Walker says, Steiner said that the human heart would become integral to future humans in a different way than we know it now. It would be able to build and create things. Any ideas?
Interesting. Well, we're developing a number of different faculties into that root race. I'm going to tell you something else that's strange about the root race piece, because there's a great deal of talk in theosophy and anthroposophy of coming out of the fourth root race into the fifth root race, and how that a lot of that developed. And by the 15th century, our conscious mind and sense of self and ego and all that really have developed remarkably. But the Casey work talks about how we're going from the fourth root race into the fifth root race. And I have to be honest with you, I'm not sure why there's a discrepancy between those two. I find that very interesting. And because you expect all the mystery stuff to correlate. Well, it doesn't. So it makes you wonder about this. But just in terms of what you're talking about, the sixth root race that we're moving into, this is supposed to be a telepathic group. And I had a thought when I was putting the show together that a lot of the stuff around the rush of the World Economic Forum and, just the general thrust of the kind of global dictatorship technocracy that's attempting to take over. One of the pieces I think that's involved here is that they want to control the inception of that root race, that they're afraid all the things we've built up and all the rest of it, if humanity moves into another stage, it'll all dissolve and we will lose our incredible position. So part of this speed up and freak out and, letting themselves be seen the way that they're letting themselves be seen as kind of bloodthirsty dictator types, control freaks, could be in fact related to the thing that they realize if we let the sixth root race take hold, we'll be out of business, our progeny and all the rest of it. So this story could run very, very deep, and they may be trying to control that root race that is humanity's future, just like New Jupiter and all the rest of it. That makes a lot of sense to me.
We have to address this. Okay, so Third Eye says, almost all prophecies say mankind does not survive this.
Well, it's interesting because I remember reading about Jung having, at the end of his life, this incredibly terrible vision. And then I remember Philos the Tibetan, as we know, and his big disaster visions and things like that. But the thing is, it seems to be, it's a variable thing. So there's the war of all against all. That doesn't sound like a lot of fun either, right? That Steiner puts out there. But they're talking about conditions that are going to be met. I guess the whole question is going to be, how do we meet those conditions? Can you imagine being someone in 1928, 1929 the Great Depression hits, but you're like getting by. And in the 1930s, you're like, hey, life's getting better. There's good music, there's good films, and I'm having a good time. And then boom, you're in World War II, and Hitler is there, and Stalin wants you, and, you know, and Hitler's got death camps. And somehow, when nobody was looking, he developed the biggest army on the planet, you know. These are the things. So humanity's been through incredibly apocalyptic events leading up to the century that we're in now. I think the thing that got missed is that we thought we were done with it. We thought we had learned the lesson, but instead the forces that had caused those very disasters and the mystery schools behind them, or I should say the left-hand path secret societies that caused those things, they grew in power, playing on this idea that, oh, we've achieved so much and the world wars are over and Vietnam's over. And in the background, they were planning this thing. So instead of developing that kind of utopia, we all could be progressing, and they've developed this thing. And it's a centralization, and it leads to a war that's much bigger than anything we saw in World War II. So, but humanity really, you know, got through these incredible difficulties. So we have it in us to do it. And I believe in that David and Goliath story. I definitely do.
Yeah. And ultimately, I mean, what are we here for? You know,
Yes.
who are we? We have to answer this question for each one of us, right? For ourselves. And it's, you know, it has to be for soul growth, and you can grow. This isn't the end, right? It's not where I'd love to just be here to have a nice, pleasant human life, right? You know, with a house and a pool and kitties and all of that. But ultimately, you know, what am I really here for? And why have I reincarnated how many times, right? It's for soul growth.
Yes.
And you know what? Trauma can assist soul growth. It already has in this incarnation. We have to acknowledge that. So no matter what happens here, my soul will go on, you know, and it's my job to make sure I grow from this experience, that I'm not diminished by it, that I'm not crushed by it, even if it kills me, that I grow from it, that I am larger for it, and bolder and more courageous. Absolutely. And more loving because of it.
Well, I think about the Native Americans facing off against us, and this is the land of the bravery of the Native Americans. So the incredible things that they went through. And I think it was Joseph Campbell who made the point, you know, they weren't hanging on, you know, they understood that their life was their life, and they were going to face the challenges that came before them. So this is the nature of the thing. I do feel that the possibilities exist for all these things to move in a positive direction through the unmasking of so many of the forces that are controlling these things. And I think that power rests with us ultimately. And that's what we're all doing here. And with that, Miss Olivia, we're going to call it an evening.
Okay. I have many people to thank. Okay. Gil and Joy R., Eurythmy is Fun, Mark Lane, W.C. Ray, Global Atlantis, Christopher Lombardo, Izzy the Great, Kat Gray, The Drunken Scoundrel, Warlock, Flash Gordon, Rosterman the Seer, Jordan Banner, Occult Fan, L.R., Erica Swenson Elliott, Russ B., Tricky Vicky, Bob Bindert, Wait a Minute 72, Sherry 333, Floor A, Bo Krills, Andrew Brown, Violet Lotus, Bari, Laurent Rawlings, Jim Sarge 3ID, Pye Nielsen, David Gilker, and Bobo the Clown. Thank you so much.
Wow, tremendous support, and we really appreciate it. It helps us to deliver the shows that we want to really bring to you on a regular basis. I'm going to do some shout outs here. Holy Fool, thank you. Really great. Thanks for being here. Terrific. I know Gigi's out there. Gigi, we have to talk really soon because we're going to have a lot to talk about. Happy to discover y'all are Bauhaus fans. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I guess Peter Murphy is in rehab. I didn't like hearing that, but hopefully he comes back strong. I'm sure he still has a lot to do. Chrissy, you're out there. Thank you so much. Yeah, happy birthday again. Oh, she's grateful to be on this journey of life with you all. Thank you, Chrissy. We're happy to have you here. Great contributions there in the ideas room. And I know your eyes are to the skies in Utah as well. Al Qaeda, moving from a punishment reward mindset to an empathetic mindset. Yeah, isn't that interesting? I mean, there's so many opportunities in that. Think about that. Gypsy Moon, thank you for putting it for not putting commercials on your show. This is very interesting, and Olivia can attest to this. I get offered the I mean, there's so many commercial offers from everything from gold companies to lifestyle. You would not believe the offers that we get for this stuff. And I just cannot see running ads against this work. It's tough. And so we really appreciate your support. Najat, happy birthday. It's fantastic. It's a great birthday. I hope it's fantastic for you. Chris Christensen, thank you very much, sir. And he says, love the show. Keep up the great work. Great people in the ideas room tonight. Just what an onslaught of wonderful questions. It was pretty interesting. I have to say, like, a lot of them made me think, well, I'm thinking on a certain track, but you guys are making me think other things. Thank you, DJ and Olivia, for another great show tonight. That's Astro Sam 2022. Fantastic. Did Biden's speech cross the Rubicon? Oh, yeah, absolutely. The actions of his administration already have. I mean, he really is the stooge, and that group that's propping him up there. That was a dark moment, and those guys are going into just a real spiral. And it's going to be terrible to watch, but we'll get through it. I can see DJ doing ads for lying on Virginia Beach is full of gold. Exactly. Come to Virginia Beach and lie on gold. I tell people about that story about when everyone was asking Casey about how do I, get my whole psychic powers thing. And they thought he's going to give us a psychic method and we're going to like wake up and be Edgar Casey. And he said, well, the first thing you can do is like push elderly people along the beach in a wheelchair on Virginia Beach to give them like the sights and the sounds and the whole thing. It'll put you in the right frame of mind, meaning get service oriented first, and then everything else can be added to you. And I think that that's a great lesson. I live near Virginia Beach. There you go. The Gazarian. That's a pretty good place to live, and definitely a fantastic beach. And the Casey ARE is right there, along with a lot of good little food places. Fantastic. Karen Carpenter, thank you. Faith and Works. Look at some real good Steiner fans in here too. Yes, Frank Monday. Per Adva ad Astra. Through difficulty to the stars. Definitely with you. Gigi, she's out there. Gigi's been doing unbelievable shows lately. If you haven't been on Gigi Young YouTube channel lately, go there, because she's been just knocking it out of the park. And just you wait, because we're going to do some great shows with Gigi in September. And I know Gigi's gearing up for it. I can feel it right now. And I'm not even that psychic, right?
You're very psychic.
That speech was wild. I agree with you. I agree. Unbelievable. Yes. Nonviolence is the answer. Be like Jesus Christ and Gandhi. It's fundamental. Well, they know from the mystery school perspective is, you can't achieve anything through violence. So that, that makes it pretty easy. That's not how to achieve things. No question about it. Fantastic. Chrissy says, Dark Journalist Conference in Virginia Beach. That's the hot zone. Absolutely. Whoa. Can you imagine? Why did the Casey people choose Virginia Beach? Watch out. Something deep going on there. Come on. Let's get real. Lucy Rose. Is even this God's plan? Yes, I would say so. There are stranger things than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Oh, there's some Shakespeare back there. It's in the back of my head. Scarlet Fire. You are the universe expressing itself as a human for a little while. Eckhart Tolle. We don't hear enough about Tolle anymore. What happened to him? Very interesting guy. Fantastic to have you all here with me. I have so many Steiner quotes left. You're going to have to wait for next time. And we will see you all next week. Fantastic to have so many of you here with us. And Miss Olivia, bravo. Excellent job.
Thank you.
You did a great job this evening. And the Ideas Room is in your debt.
Let's end with a beautiful picture.
Which one?
One of those. One of the groovy pictures.
Oh, yes. Oh, I picked up the space fence one. Well, you know, I have to say, this picture.
That's a cool picture.
The eighth sphere draw on the head is quite fascinating. But it is this picture of Olcott going into trance during the sex ceremony. Just fascinating. Those incredible people, Besant, Olcott, Blavatsky, Steiner. Wow. We stand on some amazing shoulders for sure. We will see you all next week. And remember, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends, as we understand. Miss Olivia?
Okay. God bless everybody.
Fantastic. Great to have so many of you here with us. And we'll see you all next week.
Happy Labor Day.
Happy Labor Day, exactly. We know Major Tom's a junkie.